On the night Grace Carter walked into her husband's mansion and found another woman wrapped in her dying mother's handmade blanket, something inside her went completely silent. Not the silence of defeat, the silence of a decision already made. Ryan Montgomery, billionaire, architect of his own myth, didn't flinch. He poured the anniversary wine Grace had kept for 15 years into another woman's glass, looked at his wife standing in the doorway, soaked from the storm outside, and told her she was standing in a house that had never truly belonged to her. He expected her to break. She didn't. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who was supposed to love you, stay with me until the very end. Drop a like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Part 1. The rain came without warning, the way certain kinds of betrayal always do. Grace Carter had been driving for 40 minutes through the kind of weather that makes you grip the steering wheel too tight, knuckles pale, jaw locked, the wipers slapping back and forth in a rhythm that almost sounds like an argument. She'd been on the road since 6 in the evening, coming back from the hospital where she'd spent the afternoon beside a woman who no longer remembered her own name on good days. The nurse had told Grace that her mother, Eleanor, was having one of her harder weeks. The word the nurse used was sundowning, a clinical, tidy word for something that felt violent and shapeless, the way Eleanor would turn her face toward the window in the late afternoon and start talking to people who weren't there. Grace had sat beside her for 3 hours anyway. She'd held Eleanor's hand. She'd watched her mother's lips move around words meant for a different room, a different decade, a different life. She had not cried. Grace Carter had stopped crying about her mother's illness 8 months ago, not because the grief had passed, but because she had learned, somewhere between the diagnosis and the second specialist opinion, and the first time Eleanor forgot her daughter's face, that grief left unchecked could swallow you whole, and someone needed to remain functional enough to pay the medical bills. The gate to the Montgomery estate opened with its usual slow, theatrical swing. Grace had always found it slightly absurd, a gate that heavy, that ornate, designed to impress rather than protect. Ryan had installed it 2 years into their marriage when his company crossed the billion-dollar threshold. He'd commissioned it from a metalwork artist in Florence and had it shipped in 3 separate crates. He'd never asked her opinion on it. She'd never offered one. She parked in the circular drive and sat for a moment with the engine running, the rain hammering the roof of the car in a sound that was almost soothing. She was tired in a way that had moved past physical into something structural, something that lived in the architecture of her bones. She had a hospital visit receipt in her purse, a voicemail from her mother's care coordinator she hadn't returned yet, and a bottle of Chateau Margaux in the passenger seat that she'd been saving for years, tucked away in a temperature-controlled sleeve, because today was their anniversary, and she had told herself she was going to sit across from her husband and drink wine that cost more than her first month's rent at the cafe and just exist together. Just exist together for one evening without his phone face down on the table between them like a small, deliberate insult. She turned off the engine. She grabbed the wine and her small bag. She went inside. The foyer was lit low, which was unusual. Ryan preferred the main lights. He'd once complained that the ambient lamps made the house look like a therapy waiting room. The marble floors caught the light from somewhere deeper in the house, and Grace stood for a moment in the entrance, still damp at the shoulders, listening. There was music. Something orchestral, low and serious, the kind of thing Ryan played when he was in a particular mood. Expansive, self-congratulatory, a man listening to the soundtrack he believed matched his life. She followed the hallway past the gallery wall where framed photographs of Ryan's company milestones were arranged in careful chronological order. Product launches, magazine covers, ribbon cuttings. Grace appeared in exactly 2 of the photographs on that wall. She had counted once during a dinner party, while a journalist asked Ryan how much his wife influenced his vision, and Ryan had smiled and said she was his greatest inspiration, and then turned back to the journalist without waiting to see if Grace agreed. She pushed open the door to the main sitting room. The fire was lit. The Margaux she had been saving, her bottle, the one she'd wrapped in cloth and kept in the back of the wine cellar behind the burgundies Ryan never touched, was open on the side table, already half empty in a crystal decanter. And Victoria Hayes was sitting on the leather sofa wearing Grace's mother's blanket. The blanket was unmistakable, Eleanor Carter had made it during the first year of her illness, when her hands still obeyed her, when the disease was still in its polite early stages and hadn't yet taken her memory in whole, swallowing pieces of it the way the tide takes sand, gradually, then suddenly. Eleanor had worked on it for 4 months. She'd used specific colors, dusty blue, cream, a thread of deep amber that she said reminded her of Grace's hair in the summer when Grace was small. It was not a beautiful blanket in the way expensive things are beautiful. It was beautiful the way handmade things are beautiful, imprecise, particular, carrying the specific fingerprints of the person who made it. Grace had kept it in her closet, folded on the top shelf, wrapped in the same tissue paper Eleanor had laid it in the day she'd given it to her. She had not taken it out in 6 months. She had not even touched it. Not because she'd forgotten it was there, but because some things, once you begin to use, begin to change. And Grace was not ready for the blanket to change. It was around Victoria's shoulders now, casual as a throw, the kind of thing you reach for without thinking when you're comfortable in a space. In a life. In someone else's house. Ryan was standing by the fire with a glass in his hand. He saw her. He did not look startled. He did not look apologetic. He looked, and this was the part that Grace would think about for a long time afterward, almost relieved, as if the evening had been building toward this moment, and now that it had arrived, he could stop holding his breath. "You're back early," he said. Grace looked at the blanket, then at Ryan, then at the decanter, her wine, open, poured, and she thought about the drive to the hospital this afternoon, and her mother's hands, and the 40 minutes in the rain, and the way she had been carrying something fragile and careful inside herself for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like not to be careful. "That's my mother's blanket," she said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by how steady it was. Victoria Hayes shifted on the sofa. Grace had met her twice before, Ryan's VP of External Strategy, a woman who gave the impression of someone who had rehearsed her confidence until it became indistinguishable from the real thing. She was younger than Grace by 4 years and dressed now in what appeared to be Ryan's cashmere sweater. She didn't say anything. She looked at Ryan the way people look at someone they believe will handle the situation. "Grace," Ryan started, and then he stopped, and the pause was its own kind of answer, the space where an explanation should have been and wasn't. "That's my mother's blanket," Grace said again. "Eleanor made it. She made it in the first year of her diagnosis, when she could still remember what she was making it for. I kept it in tissue paper on the top shelf of my closet." "I know what it is," Ryan said. "Do you?" "I went looking for a blanket. She was cold." The simplicity of it landed like something blunt. He went looking for a blanket. There were blankets in 4 other closets in this house. There were blankets in the guest rooms, and the cedar chest at the end of the hall, and the linen cupboard off the main bathroom. He had gone to her closet, her specific closet, her top shelf, and taken the one thing in this house that did not belong to the house at all, the one thing that had never been part of their shared life, but was entirely, irreducibly hers. "You should leave," Grace said to Victoria. Victoria looked at Ryan. Ryan set down his glass. "This is still my house, Grace. You don't get to—" "She should leave," Grace said. "I'm talking to my husband." There was a silence. Then Victoria stood, and the blanket slid off her shoulders onto the sofa cushion, and she walked past Grace without looking at her, and Grace heard her heels on the marble in the hallway, and then the front door, and then nothing. Ryan poured himself more wine. Her wine. He didn't offer her a glass. "I know what you think this is," he said. "Tell me what it is." "A mistake in judgment. A lapse." He said the words clinically, like a man reading from an incident report. "It doesn't change what we've built." "You don't know what we've built," Grace said. "I built this house, this life." "You built your company," she said. "I was something you kept in it." Ryan's jaw tightened. "That's not fair." "You opened my mother's anniversary wine for someone else." She kept her voice flat, not because she didn't feel anything, but because what she felt was too large for the room. "You went into my closet and took the only thing she made with her hands before her mind stopped working, and you put it around a woman you've been sleeping with on my sofa." She paused. "And your first sentence when I walked in was, 'You're back early.' What do you want me to say?" "I don't want you to say anything." "Then what?" "I want to understand something," she said. 5 years. 5 years I came home to this house. I sat at that table and listened to your board meetings and your acquisition calls and your stories about men who underestimated you. And I never asked you for anything I didn't think you could give. She looked at him, really looked, the way you look at something you are about to leave and want to remember clearly. Did you ever once wonder who I was? Not what I could do for the house or what I looked like at your company events, or whether I was going to make things uncomfortable with the investors. Who I was. Ryan was quiet. The fire crackled. The orchestral music was still playing from somewhere. The room smelled like her wine and his indifference and 15 years of someone else's effort. You're a talented woman, Ryan said finally. I've always said that. You said I was surprisingly sharp at the Barrington dinner when I corrected the CFO's compound interest calculation, Grace said. Surprisingly sharp. Those were your words. That's not... And when I told you I'd been accepted to the doctoral program at Caldwell, you told me it was admirable, but impractical given the timing of your Series D. She watched his face. You never asked me what I wanted to study. You said impractical and I didn't correct you, and then I made dinner, and that was the end of it. Ryan Montgomery was a man who did not apologize easily, not because he lacked the emotional range for it, but because apology implied having been wrong. And Ryan's entire internal architecture had been built around the certainty of his own judgment. He had built a company from nothing. He had made decisions that hundreds of business analysts had called reckless, and then watched those decisions pay off. The world had rewarded his certainty consistently enough that he had stopped examining it. You're upset, he said. I'm not upset, she said. I'm finished. She set the Margot down on the side table next to the open decanter. She did it gently. She wasn't angry enough to break things. Had never been that kind of angry. Had always been the other kind. The kind that goes inward and restructures itself into something colder and more precise. She reached into the collar of her shirt and unclasped the necklace Ryan had given her for their 3rd anniversary. A single diamond on a fine platinum chain, something he'd had his assistant select from a catalog and have delivered to the house in a velvet box. And she laid it next to the wine. Then she took off her wedding ring. She placed it on the marble surface beside the necklace. She picked up her small bag. She went to the sofa and folded the blanket, Eleanor's blanket, carefully, in the same way her mother had shown her to fold it, corners first, then in thirds, and she tucked it under her arm. Grace. Ryan's voice shifted. Something in it changed, something that was almost human and almost uncertain. Where are you going? Away, she said. You don't have... He stopped, recalibrated. You need to think about what you're doing. You don't have access to the accounts. The house is in the company trust. You have... He paused, and Grace heard what he didn't say, the word he chose not to use but meant anyway. Nothing. You have nowhere to go. Grace looked at him one more time. Ryan Montgomery was handsome in the way powerful men sometimes are, through the accumulated effect of money and confidence and the belief that the room is always arranged around them. He was 51 years old, and he wore it well, and he had built something real from ambition and nerve. And he was also standing in his living room beside a decanter of wine that didn't belong to him, in front of a fire that his housekeeper maintained, in a house that his accountant structured, looking at a woman he had lived beside for 5 years without ever once asking who she was. I know exactly where I'm going, she said. She walked out into the rain. The gate swung open at her approach. Motion sensor, mechanical, indifferent. She walked through it and kept walking until the estate lights were behind her and the street was dark and wet, and the rain was coming down in long, cold sheets, and she pressed Eleanor's blanket against her chest to keep it dry beneath her coat. And she did not run. She had 1 bar of signal on her phone by the time she reached the corner. She made 1 call. It rang twice. Daniel, she said, when it connected. His voice on the other end was alert, no confusion, no grogginess despite the hour. She had chosen Daniel Reeves for exactly this quality. He woke up from dead sleep ready. He'd told her once that he'd trained it out of himself after 2 years in the kind of work that required it, and she'd believed him without asking what kind of work. Is it time? He said. The rain was loud. A car passed and threw a sheet of water from a puddle at the curb. Grace stood still and let it happen. Start everything, she said. Daniel exhaled. Not nervousness, she knew. Relief. The same kind of relief she'd heard in Ryan's voice when she walked in, but different in every way that mattered. Ryan had been relieved that something was finally happening to him. Daniel was relieved that something he had been asked to wait for was finally allowed to begin. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Give me 72 hours." She ended the call and put the phone in her pocket and stood in the rain for another moment, her hand pressed flat against Eleanor's blanket through her coat, feeling the uneven texture of the yarn, the slight irregularity of her mother's stitching. Then she began to walk. Across the city, in a building whose address Ryan Montgomery had never known existed, servers that had been dormant for 14 months began their wake sequence. Files that had been encrypted and time-stamped and waiting with the patience of something built to wait began to move through the network. 3 separate legal entities, registered in different states, linked to different holding structures, invisible to anyone who hadn't been told exactly where to look, began the slow mechanical process of becoming visible. Patent applications for 11 separate innovations filed under shell company names resolved to their true owner. 2 law firms received automated emails with attached documents that their senior partners had been instructed to open only upon receiving a specific authorization code, a code that had just been sent. Investment positions accumulated over 2 years in 17-second increments, structured to avoid detection, finally began to consolidate. Grace Carter walked through the rain carrying a blanket and a small bag, and the city had no idea what had been set in motion. Neither did Ryan Montgomery. He was still standing in his living room. He had already refilled his glass. He was already calculating. She'll come back. She always comes back. They always do. She doesn't have access. She doesn't have contacts in the financial world. She's a cafe waitress with a sick mother and a doctorate she never finished and a brilliant mind she never used. He was so certain of what he knew. He had never once asked himself what he didn't. 3 days later, Grace was sitting at a workbench in a repurposed warehouse in the Garfield district, the kind of neighborhood that looked like it was waiting to become something else, surrounded by engineering schematics she had last touched 14 months ago. The warehouse smelled like metal shavings and cold concrete, and the coffee Daniel kept bringing her in paper cups, and the fluorescent lights above the workbench were the unflattering kind that showed everything, every circle under her eyes, every line across her forehead, every hour she had not slept. She was the happiest she had been in 5 years. The team around her, 6 engineers and 2 materials scientists, all of whom had agreed to wait for her call and had spent the intervening months at other firms, keeping their heads down, counting, moved with the focused, quiet energy of people who knew what they were there to do. Nobody asked about Ryan. Nobody asked about the marriage. They asked about the propulsion housing stress tests and the ceramic thermal shield calibration, and whether the simulation data from the previous run needed to be rechecked. And Grace answered them, and they worked. On the 4th day, her phone showed 14 missed calls from Ryan's number. She did not return any of them. On the 6th day, she received a text. "I've hired someone. Don't make this more complicated than it needs to be." She showed it to Daniel. Daniel said, "He hired Marcus Trent." "Trent's thorough," she said. "He's going to find everything." "I know." "You're not worried." Grace looked at the schematic in front of her, a cross-section of the propulsion system she had been developing in fragments, in stolen hours, across the last 4 years of her marriage. She had done the first 3 years' worth of equations on paper, at the cafe counter during slow afternoons, and shredded the paper before she came home. The full design existed only in her mind and in the encrypted files that now lived on the servers in the Garfield building. "Trent finding everything is the point," she said. "Let him find it." Daniel looked at her for a moment. He had the expression he got when he was recalculating her, updating some internal assessment that he never quite shared aloud. He'd been doing it since they first met, 2 years ago, when she'd walked into the law office where he worked and sat across from his desk and told him calmly that she needed help structuring the activation of an inheritance she'd been aware of for 7 years and had never touched. She had explained with the same steadiness that now kept her voice flat during difficult board calls and rainfall and the discovery of other women on her sofa, that she had a reason for the timing, and she would explain it when the time came, and in the meantime she needed everything structured correctly, and she needed to know that it would hold. Daniel had asked one question. "How long do you need it to hold?" She'd said, "However long it takes for me to finish what I'm building." He'd drawn up the papers. On the 9th day after Grace walked out of the estate, Marcus Trent delivered his report to Ryan Montgomery. Ryan sat in his office, the same office where he'd closed 14 acquisitions and taken 3 separate companies public, and read the file that told him his wife was the granddaughter of Arthur Whitman. He read the line about the inheritance. He read the number. He read it again. His assistant, Carla, later told the only person she trusted with the information that she had never seen Ryan Montgomery go that specific color before. Not angry red, not the cold pale of strategic calculation, but something in between, a color that didn't have a name, the color of a man whose map of the world had just been handed back to him with entire continents missing. He read about the degrees, the aerospace engineering, the materials science, the dissertation she had been 2/3 through when she'd come home to care for her mother. He read about the 11 patents. He sat with the file for a long time. Then he called his lawyer. Then he called Victoria. Then he sat alone in his office for 40 minutes without calling anyone, which was, by Carla's count, the longest Ryan Montgomery had been alone and silent in 12 years of working for him. What Ryan did not know, what Marcus Trent's thorough and expensive investigation had not yet uncovered because the final layer had only just been activated 48 hours earlier, was that Grace Carter now held a 9.3% stake in Montgomery Technologies. Not in her name, not directly. Through a chain of investment vehicles so carefully structured that it had taken Trent's firm 3 more weeks to trace it, and by the time they did, the position had consolidated further, 11.7%. She was the 3rd largest individual shareholder in the company Ryan had built from $40,000 and a rented desk in a shared workspace in 2009. Grace was aware of the exact moment the discovery reached Ryan because Daniel texted her a single word: found. She was standing at the workbench when she read it, running a thermal calibration sequence, her hands steady, her breathing even. She set the phone face down on the bench. She finished the calibration. Then she allowed herself, very briefly, the smallest possible smile. Not triumphant, not cruel, just the expression of a person who has been holding something carefully for a very long time and can finally, at last, begin to set it down. The announcement of the Caldwell Global Technology Conference was made the following week. The keynote speaker had been confirmed 6 months earlier under a corporate alias. Dr. Grace Carter. The conference was in 11 weeks, and somewhere across the city, in a building that did actually belong to him, Ryan Montgomery finally began to understand that he had spent 5 years married to a woman he had never once tried to know, and that the consequences of that failure were only beginning to arrive. He just didn't know yet how far they reached. The call came at 6:47 in the morning, 11 days after Grace walked out of the estate, and Ryan Montgomery answered it on the second ring because he had not been sleeping anyway. "She owns what?" he said. His lawyer, Philip Cross, had been with Ryan for 9 years. He had negotiated hostile takeovers and structured acquisitions that made regulatory bodies nervous and talked Ryan out of 3 lawsuits that would have gone badly. He was not a man who used dramatic phrasing. He was not a man who called before 7 in the morning unless the situation required it. 11.7%, Philip said. Consolidated through a chain of 6 investment vehicles. The outermost layer is a Delaware holding company registered in 2021. It took Trent's team 3 weeks to get through the structure because each layer was set up by a different firm in a different state. It's clean, Ryan. Everything's clean. There's nothing to challenge. Ryan was standing at the window of his home office in a shirt he hadn't changed out of since yesterday. The estate grounds below were silver with early morning frost, the kind of cold that arrived in late October and made everything look like it had been preserved. "She's been doing this for 2 years," he said, "at minimum. The earliest vehicle was registered 26 months ago, but the inheritance, the Whitman estate, that's been sitting untouched since she received the documentation 7 years ago. She never accessed it, not a dollar. 7 years. She met you 6 years ago." Ryan was quiet. The implication settled into the room without anyone needing to say it aloud. "Who else knows?" Ryan said. "Right now, Trent's team, me, and you. But Ryan." Philip paused, and the pause had weight to it. "The conference is in 10 weeks. If she's the keynote and the press connects her to the shareholder position, I know. The board is going to I said I know, Philip." He hung up. He stood at the window for a while. The frost on the lawn didn't move. Nothing moved. It was the kind of stillness that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the moment before a structure fails, that last second of silence before the collapse becomes audible. Ryan Montgomery had made his fortune on reading situations correctly before other people did. He had an instinct for the shape of a problem, for where it was going, and he had trusted that instinct for 22 years because it had been right enough times to justify the trust. But standing at the window with his phone still warm in his hand, he had the unfamiliar and deeply unpleasant experience of recognizing that he had been looking at the wrong problem entirely. For 11 days, he had been trying to locate a wife who had left him. For 2 years before that, he had been running a company. For 5 years before that, he had been married to a woman he had filed away, categorized, understood, and stopped examining. He had been wrong about all of it. The question was how wrong, and in how many directions, and whether the damage was the kind that could be managed or the kind that simply ran its course. He called Victoria. She answered on the 4th ring, which was new. She had always answered immediately before, and her voice had the specific quality of someone who was awake but had been lying still in the dark for a while, thinking. "I need you in the office at 8, he said. "Ryan, I think we should talk about 8 o'clock, he said. "Conference room B. Bring the Q3 projections." He ended the call. He went to shower and he stood under water that was too hot for too long, and he thought about the blanket, which was a strange thing to find himself thinking about. Not the inheritance, not the shares. The blanket. He had gone to Grace's closet that evening because he had been in a particular mood, expansive, self-regarding, the mood he got when something had gone well at work, and he wanted the world around him to confirm his sense of his own significance. And Victoria had said she was cold, and he had gone to the closet and seen the blanket on the top shelf and taken it without thinking. He had not thought about where it came from. He had not thought about what it was. He had seen a blanket and taken it, the way he took everything in the house, with the uncomplicated confidence of someone who considers ownership a settled matter. Grace had looked at him from the doorway with rain in her hair, and he had seen something in her face that he had not recognized at the time, that he was only now, standing in a shower that was fogging the mirror, beginning to name. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even grief. It was the expression of someone making a final assessment, tallying a column of numbers, and arriving at a sum that had been inevitable for a long time. He turned off the water. He got dressed. He went to work. The office of Montgomery Technologies occupied the top 4 floors of a building on Meridian Avenue that Ryan had purchased outright 3 years ago because leasing had started to feel like a concession. The lobby had a specific kind of architectural authority, high ceilings, clean lines, the kind of space that communicated that the people who worked here had decided what the future looked like and were in the process of building it. Ryan walked through it with the long-practiced ease of a man who owned the floor he walked on, which he did, and took the elevator to 37. Carla was already at her desk. She handed him a coffee and his morning brief without making eye contact, which meant she already knew something was wrong, which meant it was spreading. "Who called you?" he said. "Martin Chen called David Park. David Park told me." Martin Chen was on the board. David Park was Ryan's VP of Finance. "What did Chen say?" Carla set her tablet down and looked at him directly, which she only did when she had decided the information required it. "He said he'd seen an unusual consolidation pattern in the shareholder register, and he wanted to discuss it before the next board meeting." "When's Chen's next board meeting?" 3 weeks? "Move it up," Ryan said. 2 weeks. Ryan, "Move it up, Carla." He went into his office and closed the door. Victoria arrived at 8:02. She came in without knocking, which she had done for the past 8 months, and she sat across from him with the Q3 projections on her tablet and her expression arranged into something professional and composed. And Ryan looked at her and thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that he did not know her very well either, not in any way that mattered. "The shares," she said before he could start. "You know, I heard people talk, Ryan." She set the tablet on the desk. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to find out what she wants." "You know what she wants." He looked at her. Victoria's composure shifted slightly. Not much, just a millimeter around the eyes. "She built a stake in your company while living in your house. That's not someone who wants a divorce settlement. That's someone who wants a seat at the table. She could have just asked. The silence that followed was the most uncomfortable Ryan had experienced in recent memory, which was notable because the last 11 days had contained a significant range of uncomfortable silences. You would have listened? Victoria said. Ryan didn't answer. Victoria stood, picked up her tablet. I think you should talk to Philip about what a hostile shareholder situation looks like if she decides to push it. And I think... She stopped, recalibrated, the way she always did when she was about to say something she'd calculated twice. I think you should consider the possibility that the conference isn't just a career move for her. The timing, the shareholder position, the conference, it's not separate. It's one thing. She left. Ryan sat with that for a long time. Across the city, in the Garfield warehouse, Grace Carter was having a very different kind of morning. She was on her third coffee, which was two more than she usually allowed herself because she had been at the bench since 4:30. The thermal calibration from the previous week had flagged an anomaly in the ceramic bonding layer. Not a critical failure, but the kind of variance that at scale, over sustained thermal cycling, could become one. She had spent the night rebuilding the bonding sequence from the third iteration, and she was not done. Daniel came in at 9 with a paper bag that had a breakfast sandwich in it that Grace accepted without looking up. Trent found the position, he said. I know. Ryan called Philip Cross at 6:47 this morning. Grace looked up. You have Cross's line monitored? I have Trent monitored, Daniel said. Trent told Cross at 6:42. Cross called Ryan 5 minutes later. He sat on the stool beside the bench. The board is moving. Martin Chen made contact this morning. Who did Chen call? David Park first, then Louis Farber. Grace set down her stylus. Louis Farber was the board member she had been most uncertain about, a man in his 60s who had been with Ryan from the second funding round, who was loyal in the specific way that old money is loyal, practically, with an eye on the long-term position. If Farber was in the conversation, the board was taking it seriously. What's Farber's tone? She said. Cautious. He's not moving yet. He wants to see how Ryan responds. Ryan will respond by trying to buy back the position. He can't. The structure won't allow a forced sale below fair market value without triggering the poison pill provision, and he doesn't have enough liquid capital to... I know, Grace said. That's why the structure is what it is. Daniel looked at her. He did it again. That recalculation, that quiet updating. She had seen it enough times now to understand that it wasn't doubt. It was something closer to the opposite. The expression of a person who had believed something large about someone else and kept having it confirmed. He's going to try to contact you, Daniel said. I know. What do you want to do when he does? Grace picked up the stylus and went back to the bonding sequence. Let him try. Ryan called at 11:15 from a number she didn't recognize, which meant he'd borrowed someone's phone. He was not entirely without resourcefulness. She let it go to voicemail. 20 minutes later, a text came from Philip Cross's number. She had Cross's contact from a firm dinner 3 years ago that said simply, Grace, Ryan would like to speak with you. Please advise on preferred method of contact. She didn't respond to that either. At 1:30 in the afternoon, the call came that she had actually been expecting, though not quite this soon. Martin Chen. She answered. Dr. Carter, he said. She had not been called that in years. The doctorate was unfinished, technically. She had defended 2/3 of her dissertation before her mother's diagnosis pulled her out of the program. She had always intended to return. Chen was using the honorific as a signal. He had done his homework, and he wanted her to know it. Mr. Chen, she said, I think we're overdue for a conversation. His voice was even, measured, the voice of a man who had sat on 6 boards and understood that the first 30 seconds of any important exchange set the architecture for everything that followed. I understand there have been some significant developments. Some, she said. I want to be direct with you, if that's all right. I'd prefer it. The board is aware of your position in the company. We're also, and this is not something that's been publicly confirmed yet, so I appreciate your discretion, aware of your connection to the Whitman inheritance and your upcoming presentation at Caldwell. He paused. We're interested in understanding your intentions. My intentions with respect to what specifically? The company. Grace looked at the schematic on the screen in front of her. The full propulsion system, the things she had been building in fragments and silence for 4 years. She thought about what it had cost to build it the way she'd built it. The cafe shifts, the evenings when Ryan talked about his company while she sat across from him in a kitchen that had her name on nothing, the years of keeping her own mind in a separate room from her actual life. I intend to present at Caldwell in 10 weeks, she said. The work speaks for itself. As for the company, I have no hostile intentions, Mr. Chen. I bought a position because I believe the technology I've developed is compatible with Montgomery's existing infrastructure, and I thought a meaningful stake was the appropriate way to signal that. A pause. Compatible in what sense? In the sense that the propulsion system I've developed needs a manufacturing and distribution network that would take 8 years to build from nothing, and Montgomery has one. It also needs an engineering team, capital infrastructure, and board-level credibility with institutional investors. Montgomery has all of those things. And what does Montgomery get? The most significant clean propulsion innovation in the last 15 years. And the person who built it. Chen was quiet for a moment. She could hear the quality of his thinking in the silence. Not uncertainty, but calculation. The same kind of careful, experienced calculation that had made him worth listening to. There would need to be a conversation with the full board, he said. I know. Ryan would be part of that conversation. I know that too. You understand the position that puts us in. I understand the position Ryan's leadership trajectory has put you in, she said, and she said it without heat, just precise and clear, the way you state a measurement. I've reviewed the last 3 years of quarterly reports. The growth rate has decelerated in each of the last 7 quarters. The R&D budget has contracted twice. 2 of your senior engineers left for Vance Dynamics in the last 18 months, and 1 went to a startup. The board knows this. I know this. The question isn't whether there's a problem. The question is what you do about it. Another pause, longer this time. I'll be in touch, Dr. Carter, Chen said. I'll be here, she said. She ended the call and sat for a moment with the phone in her hand, and the warehouse was quiet around her, except for the hum of the servers and the ambient noise of the city through the high industrial windows. And she thought about Ryan's face the last time she'd seen it. That expression she had finally named, that last second of genuine uncertainty before his defenses reassembled. And she felt something that was not satisfaction, not vindication, but closer to the feeling of carrying something very heavy for a very long distance, and finally being close enough to the destination to let the weight shift forward, to feel the end of it approaching. She put the phone down and went back to work. Ryan found out about the Chen call at 3:15 in the afternoon when Chen's assistant called Carla to request a full board meeting for the following Friday. Not in 2 weeks. Friday. 6 days away. Ryan called Chen directly. Martin, he said when Chen answered. Tell me this is about the Q4 projections. Ryan. Chen's voice was careful. I think you know it's not. Whatever she said to you, she was professional, measured, and she knew the last 7 quarters of your growth figures better than your own CFO presented them at the last meeting. A pause. That's not nothing, Ryan. She's my wife. She's your estranged wife who holds 11.7% of your company and is giving the keynote address at Caldwell in 10 weeks. The distinction matters. Ryan's hand was tight on the phone. He was in his car. He'd left the office at 3, which he almost never did, the kind of displacement that happened when the space you controlled started to feel like the space that was closing in on you. I built this company from $40,000, Martin. I know you did. I have taken it to... I know what you've done, Ryan. I was there. Chen's voice was patient, but not kind. I'm asking you to look at what's happening now, not in 2009. Ryan didn't say anything. Friday, Chen said. Full board. We need to get ahead of this before Caldwell. Ryan drove for 20 minutes without direction, taking turns by some automatic navigation of the body, and ended up in a neighborhood he hadn't been in years, the eastern edge of the Garfield district. All converted warehouses and new construction and the jagged infrastructure of a place that was becoming something different from what it had been. He didn't know what brought him there. He would not let himself examine that too closely. He pulled over and sat with the engine idling. He called a number he hadn't used in 4 years. James Whitfield, who'd been his best friend in the first 3 years of building Montgomery Technologies, before the success had created the particular kind of distance that success sometimes creates between people who knew each other when they had nothing. James had left the company in 2019, amicably, moving to the Pacific Northwest to run a small materials firm, and Ryan gathered from the Christmas cards that still arrived to do some fishing and stop working 18-hour days. James answered on the third ring. "Well," he said, "this is unexpected." "Yeah," Ryan said. "Everything all right?" Ryan looked out the windshield at the converted warehouse across the street. One of the high windows had light in it. Not office light, the specific light of a work environment, warm and diffuse and purposeful. "Do you remember," Ryan said slowly, "the night we closed the Series A, that dinner at Cantero's?" "Of course." "You brought that woman, the engineer. Bright? She talked for 20 minutes about ceramic thermal materials, and I was lost after the first 30 seconds. James was quiet for a moment. "What made you think of that?" "Grace talked like that. When she forgot she wasn't supposed to. She'd start, on the rare occasion she'd start, and it would come out like that, dense and specific, and she'd look up halfway through and see my face, and just—" He stopped. "Stop. Ryan." "She stopped every time." "Ryan," James's voice was careful, "what's going on?" "I think I spent 5 years asking a very intelligent woman to make herself smaller, and I didn't have the self-awareness to know I was doing it," Ryan said. The words came out flat and without drama, which was the only way he could make himself say them, stripped of anything that might let him take them back. "And I think she let me do it for a reason I didn't understand, and I still don't fully understand. And I think the consequences of all of it are now," he exhaled, "significant." The silence on the line was different from the other silences he'd sat in today. James's silences had always had a particular quality to them. They didn't judge. They just waited. He'd always thought James waited too much, too easily, too willing to let things unfold at their own speed. He understood it differently now. "What are you going to do?" James said. "I don't know," Ryan said. And it was the first honest thing he had said in 11 days. Across the street, behind the high industrial window with the warm, purposeful light, Grace Carter was running a second thermal calibration sequence, and it was holding. The anomaly from the night before had been in the third bonding layer, a hairline variance in the ceramic matrix that, in retrospect, she could trace back to a calculation error she'd made 14 months ago, just before she'd suspended the project while she managed a difficult stretch with her mother's care. She had found it, corrected it, rebuilt the sequence, and run it twice. It held both times. The numbers were cleaner than they had ever been. She told no one. She simply noted it in her log with the date and time and the specific correction, and then she started the third run. Daniel appeared at 7 in the evening with a second paper bag. This one had a container of soup in it as well, which meant he had decided the situation required calories with more substance than a breakfast sandwich. "Board meeting is Friday," he said. "I know." Chen moved fast. "Chen's smart," Grace said. "He's been waiting for a reason to move fast. I gave him one." "Ryan was parked outside for 12 minutes this afternoon," Daniel said. Grace's hand paused on the calibration dial. She did not turn around. "The corner of Garfield and Merchant," Daniel said. "His car. He didn't get out. He drove away after 12 minutes. You're sure it was him?" "Plate number confirmed." Grace turned back to the calibration panel. Her hand resumed its position. Her breathing was even. "He found the building." "The building's not registered to anything you're attached to. He may have just been in the area." "Ryan doesn't end up anywhere by accident," she said. The third calibration run finished. The numbers held. She stared at the readout for a long moment. The propulsion system worked. She had known it worked, theoretically, in the way you know something you've built yourself from the frame out. You know it in the bones before the data confirms it. But the data had now confirmed it 3 consecutive times. And in engineering, 3 consecutive clean runs on a system this complex was as close to certainty as the work allowed. She reached out and put her hand flat against the housing unit. Not the device itself, not the ceramic shell or the calibration panel, but the metal frame that held the whole structure in place. It was cold from the warehouse air and faintly vibrating from the run. She had built this. In stolen hours, on shredded paper, in the back of her mind during 5 years of dinners where Ryan talked and she listened, and the other room, the room where her real self lived, got quieter and quieter. Not because she was giving up, but because she was saving it up. And there was a difference. Though no one looking in from the outside would have known. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. She knew immediately, the way you know certain things about people after 5 years, regardless of whether you understand them. The text said, "I was wrong about you. I need to talk to you." She read it once. She set the phone back down. She began the 4th calibration run. Friday arrived the way certain inevitable things arrive. Not quickly, not slowly, but at exactly the speed you most dreaded, which is to say at precisely the speed of the actual clock. Ryan wore the charcoal suit he had worn to the Series B closing and the Series D announcement, both of which had gone well, both of which had marked inflection points in the company's trajectory. Carla noticed and didn't say anything. She had long understood that Ryan's choice of clothing for significant events was a superstition he would have denied if asked about it directly. The board members arrived in ones and twos. Louis Farber, white-haired and deliberate, who had written Ryan the first check for Montgomery Technologies out of a belief that was as much personal as financial. Sandra Okafor, who had joined the board in 2020 and whose questions at every meeting were the ones Ryan always had to prepare hardest for because she never asked the ones he expected. David Park, whose face this morning had the arranged neutrality of someone managing a reaction in real time. Martin Chen, who arrived last and poured himself water and sat without looking at Ryan in a way that communicated more than looking would have. The meeting was called to order. Chen spoke for 11 minutes. He laid out the shareholder situation, the Caldwell Conference, the publicly available details of the Whitman inheritance, and Grace's engineering background. He did it without editorializing, presenting the information with the kind of flat precision that was more devastating than any dramatic framing would have been. When he finished, he looked at Ryan. "Ryan, sit," he said. "The board would like to understand your perspective on the situation." But Ryan had prepared for this. He had spent Thursday night in his office going through 4 separate framings of the situation with Philip Cross, ranging from aggressive to conciliatory, and he had chosen one and rehearsed it, and it had felt solid at 2 in the morning. It didn't feel solid now. He looked at the table. It's the same table where he had presided over decisions that reshaped the company, where he had argued positions he knew were right and some he knew weren't, but that he had needed in the moment to be right. And he thought about 12 minutes parked outside a building in Garfield where the light had been on in the upstairs window, and he thought about a woman walking into the rain carrying a blanket. "I don't have a perspective," he said. The room was silent. "I have a situation. The situation is that I have underestimated something, someone, in a way that has created a set of circumstances I did not anticipate." He looked at Chen. "I'm not going to stand here and reframe that as a strategic opportunity or a manageable complication. It's neither. My wife..." He stopped on the word just for a half second, just long enough that everyone at the table heard the stop. "Grace Carter has built a position in this company through 2 years of structured investment, and she has developed a technology that, if the conference is any indication of what she's prepared to show, is going to be the most discussed engineering development at Caldwell this year." Sandra Okafor was watching him. "I think the board should meet with her," Ryan said. Farber leaned forward slightly. "You're proposing..." "I'm not proposing anything," Ryan said. "I'm saying she has a stake. She has something significant to bring. And she is going to be standing in front of the entire aerospace and technology world in 8 weeks. We can spend the next 8 weeks positioning defensively, or we can..." He stopped. Because his phone was buzzing on the table in front of him with a news alert, and the headline was visible to everyone in the room because the screen faced up. And what it said was, "Breaking, Caldwell. Global Technology Conference confirms Dr. Grace Carter keynote. Clean propulsion system described as decade-defining by preview committee." Full demonstration. Thursday. The room went completely still. Ryan looked at the headline. He thought about what Victoria had said. It's not separate. It's one thing. He looked up at Martin Chen, who was looking back at him with an expression that wasn't triumphant, wasn't sympathetic. It was the expression of a man watching a situation arrive at its own inevitable conclusion and waiting to see whether the people involved were going to handle it with dignity. "Friday," Ryan said. "I'll reach out to her before Friday." "I think," Chen said, choosing his words with the particular care of a man who knows he's about to say something that cannot be unsaid, "that the question the board will be asking by Friday is not what you want to discuss with her." He paused. "The question will be whether the company's future looks better with your current leadership structure in place or with a different one." The room was very quiet. Ryan Montgomery sat at the head of a table he owned, in a building he owned, in a company he had built, and felt for the first time in his life the specific gravity of a floor that was not as solid as he had believed. He did not speak. He was still sitting there 20 minutes after the meeting ended, after the board members had filed out and Carla had asked twice if he needed anything, and he'd said no twice and meant it, when his phone buzzed again. Not a news alert this time, a text from Daniel Reeves' number, which he had not had before today, which meant someone had decided the time had come for him to have it. The text contained an address and a time. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, the Garfield warehouse. Ryan stared at the address for a long time. He had been outside it 2 days ago. He had sat in his car for 12 minutes and not gone in because he had not been invited, and because the version of himself that showed up uninvited to spaces where he wasn't wanted was the version he was no longer interested in being. Tomorrow morning, he was invited. He set the phone down. He understood, with a clarity that had the quality of cold water, that whatever happened at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning would not be a negotiation. It would not be a reconciliation. It would not be the beginning of something they could rebuild. It would be the end of something made official. And everything that came after would be something he did not yet have a name for. In a world that had just been permanently rearranged by a woman in a rain-soaked coat carrying a handmade blanket. A woman who had been sitting quietly beside him for 5 years, building the future, while he talked about himself. He picked up the phone. He confirmed the time, 8 o'clock. He would be there. The warehouse at 8 in the morning had a different quality of light than it did at night. Harder, more honest. The kind of light that came through industrial windows without flattery and showed everything at its actual dimensions. Ryan Montgomery arrived at 7:58 and sat in his car for 2 minutes, which was not the same as sitting outside for 12 minutes uninvited. He was aware of the distinction. He was aware of being aware of it, which was its own kind of new experience, this second layer of self-observation that had attached itself to him somewhere in the last 2 weeks like a shadow that arrived slightly before he did. He went in at 8 exactly. The interior was larger than it looked from the street. The ground floor was open and functional. Workbenches, server racks along the far wall, equipment he couldn't name arranged with the purposeful density of a space where every square foot was earning its keep. The ceiling was high, the concrete floor clean. It smelled like metal and coffee and the specific neutral smell of serious, sustained work. Grace was at the central workbench. She was wearing a gray thermal shirt and work pants, and her hair was pulled back with the kind of efficiency that meant she hadn't thought about it, just handled it. She was looking at a screen when he came in, and she finished what she was doing before she looked up, which took approximately 15 seconds, which was long enough for Ryan to understand that she was not going to arrange this meeting around his comfort. Daniel Reeves was standing near the server racks. Ryan had met him once, briefly, at a firm event 3 years ago. A compact, watchful man who had said very little and remembered everything, the kind of person who was invisible until you needed him not to be. He looked at Ryan with the expression of someone who had already assessed the situation and assigned it a category, and was now simply waiting for the category to confirm itself. "Ryan," Grace said. "Grace." She gestured to a stool on the opposite side of the workbench. Not an invitation to sit, more the way you indicate where something should go. Ryan sat. The workbench between them had a housing unit on it, a device roughly the size of a large engine block, ceramic shelled, with calibration panels along one side and connection points he didn't recognize. He looked at it. He didn't ask what it was. He was not going to ask what it was because asking would mean admitting he didn't know, and there was a version of Ryan Montgomery that would have allowed that admission to feel like weakness. He was trying, with incomplete success, to leave that version behind. "You drove past here 2 days ago," Grace said. "Yes." You didn't come in. I wasn't invited. Something shifted in her expression, not warmly, but with a kind of recognition, the way you register when something unexpected happens that still makes sense. Philip Cross called Daniel yesterday morning, she said. He's preparing a motion to challenge the share consolidation on grounds of undisclosed conflict of interest. I know. Did you authorize it? Ryan looked at her directly. No. Philip works for you. Philip works for the company. He's acting on what he believes protects the company's position. I found out yesterday afternoon. He paused. I told him to stand down. He hasn't confirmed he will. Grace held his gaze for a moment, measuring something. Then she turned to Daniel and gave him a look that communicated something Ryan couldn't read. And Daniel moved to the far end of the warehouse and began doing something at the server rack that was probably not actually necessary. Why are you here? Grace said. Not hostile. Genuinely asking, the way she asked when she actually wanted to know. Because Chen's question on Friday was whether the company's future looks better with my leadership structure in place or a different one, Ryan said, and I realized I didn't have an answer. That's not why you're here. He put both hands flat on the workbench. She looked at them. He looked at the housing unit between them. The blanket, he said. Ryan, I went to your closet. I took it without thinking, not because I didn't know it was yours. I knew it was yours. I knew what it was. But because I looked at it and I thought about its function, which was to keep someone warm, and I had it, and I used it. He paused. I think I did that with most things that belong to you. The warehouse was very quiet. You drove 40 minutes in the rain from the hospital, he said. I knew you'd been at the hospital. Carla put it on my calendar. Eleanor's check-in, 3 p.m. I saw it. I didn't... He stopped. I didn't ask you how it went. That evening, before you walked in and found... He stopped again. I didn't ask. Grace looked at him for a long time. No, she said. You didn't. I'm sorry. The apology landed in the space between them without ceremony. No preceding build-up, no emotional framework around it. Just the two words stated plainly by a man who was not practiced at saying them. Grace looked down at the workbench. She put her hand on the ceramic housing unit the way you touch something you've built, proprietary, without thinking. It's too late for that to change anything, she said. I know. Then why say it? Because it's true, he said. And I have spent a lot of years only saying things that were useful. I'm trying to say something true instead. The silence stretched. It was not comfortable, and it was not hostile. It was the silence of two people in the same room with the wreckage of something between them, neither one trying to pretend it wasn't there. Then Grace's phone buzzed on the workbench. She glanced at it. Something happened in her face. A change so small and so fast that Ryan almost missed it. Almost, but did not. A tightening. A fraction of stillness that was different from the stillness she'd been carrying all morning. She picked up the phone. She read whatever was on the screen. She set it back down, carefully, with the deliberate gentleness of someone managing a response they have not yet decided how to display. I need a minute, she said. Ryan stood. I can wait outside. Sit down. Her voice was flat. Not at him. At the situation. She looked at Daniel across the warehouse. Daniel. He was already walking over. He'd seen her face. She held out the phone to him without speaking. He read the screen, his jaw tightened, a movement barely visible, and he looked at her and said, When did this come in? Just now. Who sent it? Unknown number, but the file... She stopped. Her voice had changed. Not broken, Grace Carter's voice did not break, but there was something underneath it now, something dense and pressurized. The sound of a person managing something that required management. The file is real. I can tell from the metadata structure. It's from the patent office system. Ryan looked between them. What's happening? Neither of them answered him immediately, which told him the answer was something they were still processing themselves. Daniel set the phone on the workbench so the screen faced up. Ryan looked at it. It was a legal document, a patent filing, time-stamped, official header from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. The filing date was 14 months ago. The claimant name at the top was not Grace Carter. It was Vance Dynamics. Ryan recognized the name immediately. Vance Dynamics was the firm that had recruited 2 of his senior engineers 18 months ago. A well-funded aerospace startup with a reputation for aggressive IP acquisition and a founder, Garrett Vance, who had made his first money in defense contracting and his second money in litigation. The patent described a clean propulsion system for aerospace applications utilizing ceramic thermal bonding matrices and a specific type of combustion suppression technology. Ryan read the technical description once, slowly, and then looked up at the housing unit on the workbench, and something cold moved through him. "That's your design," he said. Grace said nothing. "Grace, that's your system." "The filing date is 14 months ago," Daniel said. His voice had the quality of someone delivering a medical report, controlled, stripped of affect, because affect was a luxury for later. She suspended the project 14 months ago to manage a difficult period with her mother's care. During that suspension, the encrypted files were... "The files were accessed," Grace said. The words fell into the room like something dropped from a height. Ryan looked at her. 3 separate access events, she said. The forensic log shows them at 2-week intervals, 14 months ago. Whoever accessed them had the decryption key. She paused. "There are 4 people who have ever had access to the decryption key. Myself, Daniel, our systems architect who left the project 8 months ago under a full NDA, and 1 other person." Ryan felt the shape of what she was about to say before she said it. "The systems architect," he said. "Who hired them after the NDA?" Daniel looked at him. "Vance Dynamics," he said. 8 months ago. The room was very still. Ryan thought about Garrett Vance, whom he had met twice at industry events, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s who smiled easily and whose company had grown faster than its engineering output could justify, which had always suggested to Ryan, in the lazy way he sometimes made assessments about competitors, that Vance was better at acquiring things than building them. He had not thought about it further than that. He thought about it further now. "The conference is in 8 weeks, Ryan said. "Yes." "If Vance files a priority claim based on that patent date, my filing is in the encrypted system under a shell company," Grace said. "Timestamped 26 months ago. The technical documentation predates the Vance filing by 14 months. I have the paper records." She stopped. "Most of them." "Most." She looked at him. It was the first time she had looked at him this morning with something that was not controlled. It was only for a second, a crack in the wall, small and quickly sealed. But Ryan had spent 5 years in the same house as this woman, and he knew the difference between Grace managing something and Grace being hit by something. "The primary mathematical proof," she said. "The derivation that establishes the theoretical basis for the ceramic bonding sequence. It's not in the encrypted files." "Where is it?" "I wrote it on paper," she said, 3 years ago, in the back of a composition notebook. I was going to digitize it." She stopped. "I didn't. I kept it in the cafe, in the office behind the counter. I trusted the physical location because no one who mattered knew I worked there." Ryan went very still. "The cafe closed 8 months ago," he said. He knew this. He knew it because Grace had mentioned it once, briefly, during a dinner where he had been mostly thinking about something else, the kind of mention that passed through his attention without leaving a mark. The owner retired. The space was being renovated. He had made a sound of acknowledgement. "I went to get the notebook when the cafe closed," Grace said. "The owner, Mrs. Felton, she said she'd set aside my things. There was a box. It had my apron in it, a coffee mug, some pens." "Not the notebook?" "Not the notebook." Daniel sat down on the stool Ryan had vacated. It was the first time Ryan had seen Daniel Reeves sit down in an uncontrolled way, without intention, and the sight of it was more alarming than anything else in the room. "We have the encrypted documentation," Daniel said. He was working through it out loud, not for their benefit but for his own. The mechanical process of a man assessing damage, while the shock of the damage was still arriving. "We have the time-stamped shell company filing. We have Grace's academic records from Caldwell establishing the theoretical framework in her dissertation chapters. What we don't have is the primary derivation proof, which is the document that which is the document that a patent attorney would use to establish priority in a contested filing, Grace said. Without it, the case takes 2 to 4 years in litigation. The conference is in 8 weeks. Nobody spoke. Ryan looked at the housing unit. He looked at Grace's hand, which was still resting on the ceramic shell, the fingers slightly spread, the way she'd touched it before the phone buzzed. Proprietary, careful, the gesture of someone in contact with something that represented years of themselves. Someone in your circle talked, Ryan said. Grace looked at him sharply. Not Daniel, he said. Not your architect. They weren't with Vance yet when the Access events happened. Someone knew you had suspended the project. Someone knew the timing and passed it to the architect before they left. He paused. Someone who knew your schedule, who knew about your mother, who knew when you'd be away from the project long enough for the Access events to go unnoticed. Grace's hand came off the housing unit. The silence in the warehouse had a different texture now. Who knew all of those things at once? Ryan said. He watched her face as she worked through it. He watched the moment she arrived at the answer, because it moved across her expression like weather. Fast, unavoidable, the kind of change that happens to a landscape, not to a person, something geological, something that reorganizes the terrain. Victoria, she said. The name sat in the air. Victoria was in the house, Ryan said. His voice was careful, each word measured, because he was reconstructing something at speed and getting it wrong would make everything worse. She saw your routines. She knew about Eleanor. I talked about it, at the house, on calls, in front of her. She knew when you were at the hospital. She knew when the project might be. She knew I had a project, Grace said. Her voice had gone very quiet. I never told her. I never told anyone at the house. But she had access to my study when I was away. There were notes, not specific, not the mathematics, but the materials lists. I kept a materials list on the desk because I was ordering through the cafe account and I needed to track. She stopped. She saw the list. She put it together, and she knew your system's architect because Vance's firm handled a contract negotiation that Montgomery was adjacent to 2 years ago. Ryan was already pulling out his phone. Don't call her, Grace said. I'm calling Philip. Don't call Philip, Grace said. Philip is already preparing a motion to challenge my share consolidation. If you call Philip before we know where he stands, we hand him information he might use in the wrong direction. Ryan stopped. We, he said. Grace heard it too. The word had arrived without either of them placing it there. Automatic, grammatical, the subject of a sentence neither of them had consciously decided to write. She looked at him. He looked at her. The housing unit sat between them, ceramic and cold and containing 4 years of her mind. I need that notebook, she said. The cafe space is under renovation. Who's doing the renovation? I don't know. Daniel. Ryan turned to him. The cafe, what's the property status? Daniel was already on his laptop. His fingers moved with the rapid automatic efficiency of someone who had spent years learning to find information faster than the situation could develop. Formerly Felton's Cafe, Merchant Street. Sale completed 7 months ago. Current owner. He stopped. Grace saw it in his face. Who owns it? She said. Daniel looked up from the screen. He had the expression of a man who has done the calculation and arrived at an answer that changes the shape of everything. Vance Dynamics Properties, LLC, he said. Registered as a real estate holding subsidiary. They purchased the building 6 months ago. The room was completely silent. Ryan sat back down on the stool. The sequence of it was so specific, so purposeful, so deliberately constructed that it had the quality of something architectural. Not opportunistic, but designed, planned across months, each element placed in relationship to the others with the patience of someone who understood that the most effective dismantling happens slowly enough that the person being dismantled doesn't recognize it as dismantling until it's already done. They had waited for Grace to suspend the project. Then they had accessed the files through the architect. Then they had filed the patent. Then they had waited for her to retrieve the notebook, the one document that could establish clear priority, and ensured that when she went for it, it would be in a building they owned. He's had the notebook for 7 months, Grace said. Her voice was completely even. That was the most frightening thing in the room. Not the revelation, not the architecture of the plan, but the specific evenness in Grace Carter's voice when she said it, the sound of a person pressing something down with both hands because the alternative was not something the situation could accommodate. "He's waiting," Ryan said. "He didn't file a challenge yet because he wants to time it." The conference. "If he waits until I'm on stage at Caldwell and files the challenge during the keynote," Grace stopped. "The press eats it alive," Ryan said. "The announcement becomes the story. The technology gets buried under the litigation. You spend 2 to 4 years in IP court while Vance gets the runway he needs to develop a competing system with your methodology and your proof." "And without the primary derivation and evidence," Daniel said, "the court timeline favors the earlier filing date regardless of the circumstantial documentation." Grace stood up from the workbench. She walked to the far end of the warehouse and stood with her back to them for a moment, looking at the high industrial windows, the gray morning light coming through. Ryan watched her. He had watched her walk away once before, in the rain, through the gate of his estate, carrying a blanket against her chest. And he had let her go because he had believed, with the comfortable certainty of a man who had never been wrong about the things he thought mattered, that the situation was simple and temporary and would resolve in his favor. He watched her now and understood, in a way that had nothing comfortable in it, that he had been wrong about more things than the situation in his living room. He had been wrong about the shape of her, about the dimensions of what she was capable of, about the cost of his own inattention, and the cost was standing at the far end of a warehouse in the gray morning light, with 4 years of her work threatened by a man who had used Ryan's own proximity to her as the instrument of the threat. It was his house Victoria had been in, his calls she had overheard, his presence in Grace's life that had made Grace's work visible to someone who wanted to take it. He sat with that. Grace turned around. Her face had resolved into something, not calm, not composed, but focused. The expression of a person who has absorbed the full weight of a situation and made the internal decision to carry it rather than be crushed by it. "The building on Merchant Street," she said. "What's the renovation status?" "Permits show active construction through the end of the month," Daniel said, "which means workers on site. During business hours, yes." "Vance wouldn't keep the notebook in the construction zone," Ryan said, thinking through it. "Too much traffic, too much liability. He'd have moved it to a secure location once they acquired the building." "His office," Grace said. "His legal team's office," Ryan said. "If he's building a patent challenge, the primary evidence goes to his IP attorney. That's Marcia Holden's firm, Holden and Park, on Centennial Avenue." He looked at Grace. "I know Marcia Holden. She represented the opposing side in 2 of my acquisitions." "Can you get to her?" "Not fast enough. Not cleanly enough. She's ethical. She won't discuss client documents, and any approach from me gets filtered through Vance's team in 20 minutes. Grace's expression shifted. Something behind her eyes moved, the way something moves when a calculation completes. "There's another way," she said. "Grace, the dissertation," she said, "my incomplete dissertation from Caldwell. The chapters I submitted before I withdrew from the program, they contain the preliminary mathematical framework, not the complete proof, but the first and second order derivations. Is it enough to establish priority? Alone? No. But combined with the encrypted timestamps and the academic record, it creates reasonable doubt about Vance's filing date," Ryan said. "It doesn't win the case," Daniel said, "but it buys time." "I don't need to win the case in 8 weeks, Grace said. "I need to present at Caldwell. I need to get the technology in front of the right people before Vance can trigger the challenge and bury it in litigation noise." She looked at Ryan. "After the conference, with the international exposure, the IP fight becomes a different kind of fight. Vance is banking on obscurity. He needs the challenge to land before the work gets global attention." "So the conference protects the work," Ryan said. "The conference makes the work too visible to suppress." She paused. "But I need the dissertation records from Caldwell, official, certified, with the submission timestamps intact. The registrar's office holds original submissions in physical archive." "How long does a certified records request take?" "Standard process, 6 to 8 weeks." She looked at him steadily. "I need them in 3 days." Ryan understood what she was asking. Not because she had asked him explicitly. Grace Carter did not, he was learning, ask for things explicitly. She stated the situation. She stated the parameters. She left the space for a person to decide what kind of person they were going to be. Caldwell's board chair is Edmund Frase, Ryan said. I funded the Frase Engineering Research Center in 2021, $2.3 million. Grace said nothing. I'll call him this morning, Ryan said. Something moved across her face. Brief, complicated, the expression of a person receiving help from a direction they had not planned for and were not certain how to categorize. That doesn't change anything between us, she said. I know. I'm not... Grace. He said her name quietly, without urgency. I know. I'm not asking it to. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and turned back to the workbench. Ryan pulled out his phone and stepped toward the warehouse door to make the call. He was 3 steps from the door when Daniel said, "Wait." The word had a quality to it that stopped both of them. Daniel was looking at his laptop screen with the expression he had worn when he read the property ownership, the expression that meant the calculation had produced an answer that changed the shape of everything again. "What?" Grace said. "The dissertation records," Daniel said. "Official submission copies, time-stamped, held in Caldwell's physical archive." He looked up. "I just pulled Caldwell's institutional records as a cross-reference for the authentication timeline." He paused. "Grace, your dissertation records were requested by an external party 6 months ago." The warehouse held its breath. "Requested by whom?" Grace said. "The request was filed through an academic research access form. The name on the form is a law clerk at Holden and Park." Grace sat down. It was the first time Ryan had seen her sit down without intending to, without choosing to, just the weight of it arriving all at once, too fast for the body to manage standing. "He has the notebook," she said, "and he has the dissertation records." The morning light through the industrial windows was very cold and very honest, and it showed everything at its actual dimensions, and what it showed was this. The most significant engineering work Grace Carter had spent 4 years building, in silence and in stolen hours, and against the full weight of a life that had been arranged around other people's needs, was sitting in the offices of a man who had spent 6 months ensuring that every document capable of establishing her priority would be in his possession before she ever walked onto a stage to show the world what she had made. She had planned for Ryan's indifference. She had planned for the board's caution and the legal complexity and the difficult conversations and the long road of proving, in the public arena, what she already knew in the private one. She had not planned for this. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Grace Carter put both hands flat on the workbench on either side of the housing unit, and she looked at the device she had built, and Ryan watched her face move through something. Not defeat, because defeat had a particular texture, and this was not it. This was something more like the expression of someone who has arrived at a wall and is measuring it, calculating its thickness, deciding not whether to get past it, but how, because the alternative is not something she is built to accept. "Then we get them back," she said. Her voice, when she said it, was the quietest and the most certain Ryan had heard it. And in that moment, watching her hands on the cold ceramic shell of the thing she had built, Ryan Montgomery understood, not as an abstraction, not as information delivered by an investigator's report, but in the way you understand things that arrive through the body rather than the mind. Exactly what kind of woman he had spent 5 years failing to see. And understood, too, that the next move was not his to make. It was hers. It had always been hers. The first thing Grace did was stand up straight, not dramatically, not slowly, with the weight of a cinematic moment behind it. She just straightened her spine and took one breath and said, "Daniel, I need everything we have on Holden and Park's document storage protocols, physical and digital. I need it in 2 hours." Daniel was already typing. Ryan was still by the door with his phone in his hand, and Grace looked at him with an expression that was not asking for his involvement, but was not excluding it either. The expression of someone who has reorganized their internal situation and is now operating from the new configuration. "Call Frase," she said, "not for the dissertation records. I need a different favor." "What favor?" "Caldwell has an IP authentication service. They use it for research submissions. an independent verification body that timestamps and certifies technical documents for academic priority disputes. It carries legal weight in patent cases because it's a neutral third party with a decades-long institutional record. She picked up her phone. If Phrase can get my encrypted files into that system in the next 48 hours, I have an authenticated priority record that predates Vance's filing by 14 months, and it comes from a source no court will dismiss. Ryan looked at her. That's not what the service is designed for. No, she said, but it's what it can do. And Phrase owes you a building. Ryan called Edmund Phrase at 8:43 in the morning. Phrase answered on the second ring, which meant he was already at his desk, which meant he was the kind of man Ryan had always respected, the kind who worked before anyone expected them to. Ryan explained the situation in 4 minutes, stripped to its structural elements, without personal context, because Phrase didn't need the personal context, and Ryan had learned, somewhere in the last 2 weeks, that the personal context was a thing he needed to stop using as insulation. Phrase asked 3 questions. Ryan answered them. There was a pause. The authentication board convenes Friday mornings, Phrase said. I can request an emergency session for Wednesday. But Ryan, I need the technical submission package by 6 a.m. Tuesday. That's 30 hours. Ryan looked at Grace across the warehouse. We'll have it, he said. He ended the call. 30 hours, he said to Grace. She nodded once and turned to Daniel. We're building the submission package. Full technical documentation, the encrypted file logs with timestamps, the shell company registration records, and the material sourcing receipts, all of it formatted for academic submission standards. She paused. I need 4 hours of uninterrupted time on the system. You have it, Daniel said, and I need you to find Victoria Hayes. The name dropped into the room with the specific weight of something that had been building for a while. Daniel looked up from his laptop. Not to confront her, Grace said. Not yet. I need to know where she is, who she's been talking to, and whether she has any direct communication with Garrett Vance in the last 6 months that's discoverable. She looked at Ryan. Can you get me her company email records? Ryan's expression tightened. Those records belong to Montgomery Technologies, pulling them without board authorization. You're still CEO. Until the board meeting. Which is Friday, Grace said. Today is Monday. You have 4 days. Ryan was quiet for a moment. He was calculating. She could see it, the same rapid internal arithmetic she had watched him do across 100 dinners and board calls and negotiations, the specific quality of attention that meant he was running outcomes. Then he took out his phone and called Carla. Pull Victoria Hayes' company communications for the last 8 months, he said. Full archive, flagged for external addresses. Send them to my personal encrypted drive. Don't log the request. A pause. Yes, that one. Thank you. He ended the call. He looked at Grace and she held his gaze for 1 second. Not gratitude, not warmth, just acknowledgement. The look of one professional recognizing a decision made by another. Then they went to work. The next 30 hours were the kind of time that doesn't feel like time in the conventional sense. It doesn't move at the speed of clocks. It moves at the speed of the problem, which is sometimes faster and sometimes so dense and specific that an hour passes in what feels like 10 minutes, and you look up from the screen to find the light has changed, and you haven't eaten, and your neck hurts, and you are somehow no closer to done than you were before. Grace worked at the primary bench. Daniel worked on the secondary system across the warehouse. Ryan worked on his phone and occasionally on Daniel's secondary laptop, pulling documents, making calls, operating in the specific way of a man who had spent 20 years knowing which people to call and how to frame the ask and where the leverage was. Skills that Grace had watched him use for himself and was now watching him point in a different direction, and the effect was considerable. At 11 in the morning, Carla sent the Victoria Hayes communications. Ryan read them first, alone, standing near the server rack with his back to the room, and Grace gave him that because she understood it was something he needed to absorb privately. She watched the set of his shoulders while she worked. She saw the moment he found what she suspected was there, a slight change in posture, not a flinch, something more like the physical response of a man absorbing a blow he had been told was coming and still found, when it arrived, harder than anticipated. He walked back to the bench and set the laptop in front of her without speaking. The email chain was dated 9 months ago. Victoria Hayes and a contact identified only as GV, which was not subtle, Grace thought, but then people who believed themselves untouchable rarely worried about subtlety. The chain covered 7 exchanges across 3 weeks. The first 3 were cautious, formal language, plausible deniability in every sentence, the kind of communication written by someone who knows they're doing something wrong and is building in retrospective cover. The 4th email was where the cover started slipping. Victoria had written, "She's pulled back from the technical work for the duration. The mother situation has her occupied full-time. The architect is ready to move on your timeline." The 5th email contained a forwarded materials list. Grace's materials list. The one she had kept on her desk at the cafe because she had believed the physical location was safe. The 6th email was from GV. It said, "Confirm the access window and the target files. We need the ceramic bonding sequence specifically. The rest is secondary." The 7th email was Victoria's reply. "Confirmed. She won't be back on the project for at least 4 months, possibly longer if the medical situation deteriorates." Grace read the chain twice. The second time, she read it with the particular stillness of someone who has already processed the shock and is now reading for information rather than reaction. She noted the dates, she noted the language. She noted the specific phrase, "the mother situation," which was the kind of phrase that comes from a person who has heard someone else discuss Eleanor Carter's illness across dinner tables and phone calls and treated it as operational data. She closed the laptop. "That's enough for a fraud claim," she said. "It's enough for criminal referral," Ryan said. "IP theft with documented conspiracy. Philip is still preparing a motion against my share consolidation." Ryan's jaw set. "I'll handle Philip." "How?" "By telling him that if he files the motion, I'll replace him." He said it flatly, without heat. "He works for the company. The company is about to need a clean legal posture more than it needs a loyalty gesture to a leadership structure that's already changing." Grace looked at him. Something moved in her expression. Assessment, recalibration. "You've already decided," she said. "About Philip?" "About the board meeting." Ryan was quiet for a moment. Outside the warehouse, the city moved at its usual indifferent speed. Traffic. Wind. The sound of something being built or demolished in the middle distance. It was hard to tell which. "I built something real," he said, "and I ran it well for a long time. And then I stopped, examining things, stopped asking the right questions." He paused. "The company deserves better than a CEO who stopped asking questions." Grace looked at him for a long time. "That's not a small thing to say," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't." They held that for a moment. Not warmly, not with the specific gravity of reconciliation. Just 2 people in a warehouse acknowledging something true. Then Daniel said, "We have a problem." He was looking at his screen with the expression Grace had learned to treat as a serious warning system. Daniel's face, when the news was bad, had a specific quality, a tightness around the eyes, a stillness in the rest of the face that was too controlled to be natural. "Vance filed this morning," Daniel said. The room went cold. "He filed the patent challenge?" Grace said. "Not the patent challenge. A civil complaint. Trade secret misappropriation against Montgomery Technologies." Daniel turned the screen so they could see it. "He's claiming that the propulsion technology Grace developed was created using proprietary research infrastructure belonging to a Vance Dynamics subsidiary, a research firm that he claims Grace consulted with 5 years ago." "That's a lie," Grace said. "It doesn't need to be true," Daniel said. "It needs to be plausible enough to trigger an injunction. If a court issues a preliminary injunction against the Caldwell presentation on grounds of disputed IP ownership, he doesn't need to win the case," Ryan said. He had gone very still. "He needs to get an injunction in place before the conference. 7 weeks. That's..." "His attorneys filed in the Northern District this morning," Daniel said. "Emergency injunction hearing is requested for..." He looked at the screen. "Thursday. 3 days." Grace sat down. The submission package for Caldwell's authentication board was due Tuesday at 6 a.m. The emergency injunction hearing was Thursday. The conference was in 7 weeks, but if the injunction came through, there would be no conference, there would be no keynote, there would be years of litigation and Vance's system, built on her mathematics, on her ceramic bonding sequence, on the work she had done in stolen hours while she sat across from a man who never asked who she was. Would be the technology that changed the aerospace industry under someone else's name while she spent the next decade in a courtroom. She understood in this moment what losing actually looked like. Not the losing she had already done. The marriage, the years, the ordinary accumulating losses of a life partly unlived. The specific, targeted, deliberate losing that someone else had engineered for her, brick by brick, over 18 months, with access to her life that she had not known she was giving. Her hands were flat on the workbench. They were not shaking. "Who's Vance's attorney on the civil complaint?" she said. Daniel checked. "Lead counsel is Barrett Soames and Wright." Ryan made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Barrett Soames represented the plaintiff in the Kellerman Dynamo case in 2019. I was adjacent to that case. We held shares in Dynamo. Soames is aggressive, he's fast, and he does not file emergency injunctions unless he believes he can get them. "Can he get this one?" Grace said. Ryan looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Ryan. The look between them had the quality of two people who have arrived at the same calculation and neither wants to be the one to say the number. "He has the notebook," Grace said. "He has the dissertation records. He has a fabricated consulting relationship that puts my work inside his IP framework. And he filed the civil complaint before we had any countermeasures in place, which means he knew we were moving." She paused. "He has someone watching." The warehouse felt suddenly smaller. Grace stood up and walked the perimeter of the space. Not pacing, more the movement of someone who thinks better with her body in motion, who needs the physical circuit of the room to process the full architecture of what she was facing. Ryan watched her and didn't speak. Daniel had learned this about her too, that the movement was part of the cognition, not incidental to it. She came back to the bench. "The consulting relationship he fabricated," she said. "It would require documentation, a contract, an NDA, deliverables, something that looks like a paper trail." "He's had months to build it," Daniel said, "but it has to be consistent with my actual timeline. I was at Caldwell until 6 years ago. I left to care for my mother. I started at the cafe. I met Ryan." She looked up. "There is no timeline in which I consulted for a Vance Dynamics subsidiary and produced technical research for them. I was not working in the field during the period he would need to document." "You'd need to prove the negative," Ryan said. "That's harder than it sounds in an emergency injunction hearing." "Unless I have someone who can account for my time during that period." She looked at him steadily. Someone was standing. Ryan understood before she finished the sentence. "I can testify to your schedule during the marriage," he said. "Every travel record, every hospital visit, every day you were at the cafe. It's all in the household accounts, the calendar records, the credit card statements. 5 years of documentation that places you in specific verifiable locations that are incompatible with the consulting relationship he's claiming. He'll argue the documentation is manufactured, that you're acting in concert with me. Then we need a third party." Ryan was thinking fast now, the way he thought when a deal was in motion, forward, fast, pruning branches as he went. "Who kept records of your hospital visits with Eleanor?" "Her care coordinator, Dr. Susan Park's office at Meridian Care. Not just visits, dates, times, length of stay, insurance billing records." Ryan was already reaching for his phone. "If we subpoena the medical facility records, not Eleanor's private records, just the visitor logs and the billing correspondence, we have an independent institutional record of your whereabouts during the period Vance needs to claim you were consulting for him. Can we get those records before Thursday? If Philip files the subpoena today..." He stopped. He put the phone down. He looked at Grace. "I have to call Philip right now and tell him to stand down on your share consolidation challenge and redirect to a defensive subpoena on your behalf. And Philip is going to ask me why. And the answer is going to require me to tell him that I believe my wife's IP claim is legitimate and that the company's legal resources should be supporting it rather than opposing it." "Yes," Grace said. "That conversation changes everything about the board meeting Friday." "Yes. It tells the board I've already chosen a side." "You have," she said. Ryan picked up the phone. He called Philip Cross. The conversation lasted 9 minutes, and Grace did not leave the room during it, and she heard Ryan's voice move through several registers. The initial professional flatness, then a brief hard silence while Philip apparently responded. Then Ryan's voice again, lower, more deliberate. The voice he used when he was not arguing but stating, which was a different thing. When he ended the call, his face was the face of a man who had just done something irreversible. "He'll file the subpoena this afternoon," Ryan said. "He's also withdrawing the motion against your share consolidation." "Is he still your lawyer?" "For now. He's deciding whether he wants to be after Friday." Ryan set the phone on the bench. "It doesn't matter. What matters is Thursday." What happened next was 36 hours that Grace Carter would remember for the rest of her life in fragments rather than sequence. The way you remember things that move too fast to store properly, that arrive in the body before they reach the mind and leave marks in both places. The Caldwell authentication submission was completed at 4:47 a.m. Tuesday. Daniel sent it at 5:58 a.m., 8 minutes before the deadline, because the final encryption verification had taken longer than projected, and Grace had sat at the bench with her hands folded on the surface in front of her, very still, for the last 12 minutes of the process, not looking at the screen, as if watching it would slow it down. The confirmation came through at 6:15. She had not slept. Ryan had not slept either. He had spent the night in the warehouse on a folding chair that Daniel had produced from somewhere, on phone calls and document reviews, and a 2-hour conversation with Martin Chen that Grace heard in pieces. Ryan's voice through the glass partition of the side office where he'd taken the call, low and continuous, the tone of a man giving an account of himself. He came out of the side office at 3 in the morning and found Grace at the bench running the propulsion system through a final calibration sequence that was not necessary but that her hands needed to do. He sat on the stool across from her. "Chen wants a statement from you before the board meeting," he said. "About what?" "Your intentions for the company, post-conference. They want to know what you're proposing before Friday so they can walk into the meeting informed rather than reactive." Grace looked at the calibration readout. The numbers were clean. They had been clean every time. "What did you tell him?" "I told him your technology is the most significant engineering development I've seen in 20 years, and that if the board had any sense, they'd be figuring out how to attach themselves to it, rather than debating the terms." He paused. "I also told him the company's growth trajectory under my leadership has been declining, and that I was aware of that before you showed up with an 11.7% stake, and that the board should have been asking harder questions about it 18 months ago." Grace looked at him. "You didn't have to say that," she said. "No," he said. "I did." Tuesday passed in the specific way that days pass when they are carrying too much, unevenly, with long stretches of brutal focus interrupted by moments that felt suspended, outside of time. Grace showered in the warehouse bathroom, which had been retrofitted with basic amenities when Daniel set up the facility and which was not comfortable but was functional. She ate the food Daniel kept providing. She answered the call from her mother's care coordinator at 2 in the afternoon. Eleanor was having a good day, the coordinator said. She had asked for Grace by name, twice, which was notable because there had been several weeks where she had not asked for anyone at all. And Grace stood in the side office with her hand pressed against the wall and said that was good news, and she would come as soon as she could, and thank you. She sat in the side office for 4 minutes afterward, alone, and did not allow herself to think about what would happen if Thursday went badly, if the injunction came through, if Vance's fabricated timeline held enough water to stop everything she had built. She had a discipline for not thinking about the losing scenario. She had developed it across years of carrying things that required her to function while carrying them, and she deployed it now. Then she went back to the bench. Thursday morning arrived at the Northern District Courthouse with the kind of weather that didn't pick a side. Gray and cold, the sky the color of unfinished concrete, a wind off the river that moved through you rather than around you. Grace arrived in a dark blazer she had bought the previous afternoon because Daniel had looked at her warehouse clothes and said nothing but had driven to a store. She looked like what she was, a scientist who had not slept enough, cleaned up precisely to the extent required by the situation, not a millimeter further. Barrett Soames was already in the hallway outside the courtroom when they arrived. He was a compact man in his 60s with a face that had the well-maintained blankness of someone who had been in rooms like this enough times to have developed a professional relationship with his own reactions. He looked at Grace when she came in and did not look away, which was a choice. And Grace looked back at him with the same steadiness she brought to everything, and let him understand that she had made herself familiar with the situation he was in and was not frightened by it. Philip Cross arrived 2 minutes later. He had the subpoenaed medical facility records and the household documentation under his arm, a physical stack of folders that represented 5 years of calendar entries and hospital visitor logs and credit card receipts that collectively made a map of a life. Grace's actual life, the one she had actually lived, which was not the life Barrett Soames was about to describe to a federal judge. Ryan was there. He had not been invited in any legal sense. He had arrived because the alternative was not arriving, and he had been making a series of choices recently that were organized around a different principle than the one he'd operated on for most of his adult life. He stood near the door, and he did not speak, and his presence in the room was the presence of a man who understood he was not the main character of what was happening and was at peace with that, or was learning to be. The hearing was called at 9 a.m. Judge Clara Moss was in her 50s, precise, with the quality of someone who had read too many emergency injunction filings built on weak foundations to approach this one with anything other than skepticism that needed to be earned away. She looked at Soames's filing. She looked at Philip's response. She asked questions that were short and surgical, the kind that cut away what wasn't necessary and left the essential structure exposed. Soames presented the fabricated consulting timeline. He presented the document trail Vance had built, clean, consistent, alarming in its specificity. Grace felt the quality of it from across the room. It had been assembled by someone who understood how these things were evaluated, what details created credibility, what inconsistencies would get flagged. It was the work of someone who had prepared for this moment carefully and for a long time. Judge Moss looked at it for several minutes in silence. Then she looked at Philip. Response. Philip presented the medical facility records first. Visitor logs, billing correspondence, parking validation receipts. The particular unglamorous paperwork of someone who had spent years getting into a car and driving to a care facility and sitting beside a person they loved. Dates that placed Grace Carter at Meridian Care during 7 of the 9 specific periods in which the fabricated consulting relationship claimed she was in meetings with Vance's subsidiary. Judge Moss looked at the records. "Explain the overlap," she said to Soames. Soames's response took 4 minutes and involved the suggestion that records could be altered and that the court should weight the documentary evidence of the consulting relationship against what he characterized as self-serving corroboration. Judge Moss looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Soames," she said, "I have been on this bench for 16 years. I am familiar with what self-serving corroboration looks like. These are medical billing records from an institutional care facility. They are not self-serving. They are, however, significantly inconsistent with your timeline." She looked at Philip. "What else?" Philip presented the household documentation, then the Caldwell authentication confirmation, which had come through at 11 p.m. Tuesday with the institutional seal that carried the decades-long credibility Grace had counted on. The authenticated priority record, 26 months of time-stamped encrypted development logs, certified by an academic institution with no stake in the outcome. The courtroom was quiet. Judge Moss took off her glasses. She looked at the documentation on her desk. She looked at Soames. She looked at Grace, directly, for the first time since the hearing began, and Grace held the look without moving, without adjusting her expression, without performing anything. "Mr. Soames," Judge Moss said, "your emergency injunction request is built on a consulting relationship that places the claimant in your client's facilities during periods when independent institutional records place her in a medical care facility attending to a family member. Your documentary evidence is specific and well prepared, which I find notable given that it appears to cover the same dates." She set down the glasses. "I am not granting the preliminary injunction." The words landed in the room. Grace felt them arrive in her body before her mind fully processed them. A physical thing, the release of something she hadn't been fully aware of holding, a tension in the muscles across her shoulders and down the length of her spine that she had been carrying for 72 hours. "I am, however," Judge Moss continued, "referring the underlying documentation submitted by the plaintiff to the court's fraud review process for evaluation of possible fabrication. She looked at Soames. Your client should be aware that the consultation records he provided are inconsistent with independently verifiable third-party data, and that the court takes that inconsistency seriously. Soames said nothing. His face had the particular stillness of a man managing the moment in real time. The injunction is denied, Judge Moss said. We're adjourned. The courtroom began to move. Chairs, voices, the shuffle of documents being gathered. Grace sat still for a moment in the middle of it. Philip was already talking. Something about next steps, about the patent challenge, about the civil complaint response timeline. And she heard his voice, but not the words. The way you hear ambient sound when something larger is occupying the foreground of your attention. Ryan was at the door. He looked at her across the room, and his expression was not celebration. He was not a man who celebrated in public, and this was not a celebration moment. This was a turning point, which was different, was more complicated, carried more forward into what came next. He looked at her the way you look at something you have finally seen clearly, with the specific sadness of clarity that comes too late to change what it might have changed if it had come earlier. Grace stood. She picked up her bag. She walked to the door. As she passed Ryan, she said very quietly, just the two of them in the movement of the departing room, "The board meeting is tomorrow." "Yes," he said. "Are you ready?" He thought about the question, not rhetorically. He actually thought about it, the way she had come to understand he thought about things when he chose to think about them honestly, which was not always but was more often now than before. "No," he said, "but I'm going anyway." Grace looked at him for one moment. Then she walked out of the courthouse and into the cold gray morning, and the wind off the river moved through her, and she kept walking, because tomorrow was the board meeting, and the board meeting was the end of one thing and the beginning of another. And she had not come this far by stopping when the hard part was still in front of her. Behind her, Barrett Soames was on his phone, speaking in a low-controlled voice to someone Grace already knew was Garrett Vance, telling him that the injunction had been denied, and the documentation had been flagged, and the situation had changed. And Vance's response, which Soames heard in his earpiece with the particular quality of information arriving that requires immediate recalibration, was 3 words. 3 words that Soames did not share with anyone in the courthouse hallway, but that Grace Carter, had she heard them, would have recognized immediately as the sound of a man who was not finished. Find the notebook. The notebook turned up on a Friday morning, 3 days before the Caldwell conference, and the way it turned up was not the way anyone had planned. Grace was at Meridian Care when her phone rang. She had been there for 2 hours, sitting beside Eleanor in the room that smelled like the specific combination of institutional cleaner and Eleanor's hand lotion, a scent that Grace had, over years of visits, stopped noticing, and then, in the last several months, started noticing again, the way you start noticing things you understand you will not always have. Eleanor was having a good day. Not a clear day. The clarity came and went without pattern, without the mercy of predictability, but a present day, which meant Eleanor's eyes tracked her daughter's face when Grace moved, and she held Grace's hand with the particular grip of someone who recognized what they were holding, even when the name for it had gone somewhere temporarily unreachable. Grace had been telling her about the warehouse, not the legal situation, not Vance, not the board meeting that had happened 2 days ago, and that Grace had not yet fully processed in any part of herself that wasn't still operational and forward-facing. She had been telling Eleanor about the propulsion system, the ceramic housing, the thermal calibration sequences, the way the numbers looked on the third clean run when she had put her hand against the cold metal frame and felt it vibrating. Eleanor listened with the quality of attention she had always brought to Grace's technical explanations, which was not comprehension exactly, but was something more than comprehension, an attention to the texture of her daughter's voice, to the aliveness in it when she talked about things she had built. The phone buzzed. "Daniel." She answered. "We have the notebook," he said. Grace was quiet for 1 second. Eleanor's hand was warm in hers. Outside the window of the care room, the November sky was the particular blue of late autumn that looks like it's trying harder than it can sustain. "Where?" she said. "Philip Cross's office," Daniel said. It was delivered this morning by courier. No sender name. The envelope had a Montgomery Technologies internal mail stamp from 2 weeks ago. A pause. There's a note inside. Handwritten. It says, "This belongs to her. I'm sorry it took me this long." Grace closed her eyes, just for a moment. "Victoria," she said. "The handwriting matches the internal memos in her company file," Daniel said. Grace opened her eyes and looked at Eleanor, who was watching her face with the soft, accurate attention of someone who could not follow the words but could read the weather of a person they had known since before that person could speak. "Is it intact?" Grace said. "Philip says it's complete. The primary derivation is there. He's had it photographically certified and digitally archived in the last hour. The original is in a locked evidence file." A pause. "Grace, we have everything." She sat with that for a moment. Not the legal meaning of it, not the strategic implications, but the simpler and more fundamental fact of it. The notebook. The 4 months of mathematics she had written at a cafe counter during slow Tuesday afternoons, the derivations that existed only on paper because she had been afraid to put them anywhere that could be found, that she had shredded and rewritten and shredded again until she had a version she trusted. And then she had put it in a box on a shelf and trusted the wrong thing and lost it. And now it was in Philip Cross's locked evidence file, intact, certified, and hers. "Tell Philip I'll be there in an hour," she said. She ended the call. Eleanor said, clearly and without any of the searching quality her speech usually carried now, "Good news." Grace looked at her. "Yes," she said, "good news." Eleanor patted her hand twice, the way she had always done, a specific gesture, 2 pats, that had meant something between them since Grace was small, that meant, "I know, I'm here, go do what you need to do." Eleanor had been doing it her whole life. She was still doing it now, even on the days when the name Grace was somewhere she couldn't reach, even when the face in front of her was familiar without being fully identifiable. The gesture remained. The body remembered what the mind sometimes couldn't hold. Grace squeezed her hand. She stood up. She pressed her lips briefly to Eleanor's forehead. Then she picked up her bag and walked out into the corridor and stood for a moment against the wall, with her hand flat against the painted concrete, not to hold herself up, but just to feel something solid and still. And then she walked to the elevator and pressed the button and went. The board meeting had happened on Friday, 48 hours after the courthouse. Grace had been present not as a supplicant or a petitioner, but as the 3rd largest individual shareholder in Montgomery Technologies, which gave her a seat and a voice and the right to speak when she chose to, which she had chosen to do once, briefly, in the first 20 minutes, before stepping back and watching the board do what boards eventually do when the information in front of them is clear enough and the leadership in front of them is honest enough to stop defending what no longer serves the company. Ryan had spoken for 11 minutes. Grace had been prepared for several versions of those 11 minutes. The defensive version, the strategic pivot version, the version where he framed his own limitations as someone else's failure. She had been prepared for all of them because she had spent 5 years watching Ryan Montgomery manage rooms, and she understood his range. What she had not been prepared for was what he actually did. He stood at the head of the table in the charcoal suit, and he told the board, in flat and specific language, that the company's growth trajectory had been declining under his direction for 7 consecutive quarters, that the R&D investment reductions had been his decisions, that the 2 senior engineer departures had followed conversations in which he had failed to hear what was being communicated, and that he had been aware of these facts and had continued operating from the same framework that had produced them because he had confused the company's past success with his own infallibility. He said, "The technology Grace Carter has developed is compatible with this company's infrastructure in a way that represents a genuine inflection point. I am not the right person to lead the company through that inflection point. Not because I lack the capability, but because the board deserves leadership that comes without the complications the current situation has created, and because I believe the company's future is better served by someone who can approach the next chapter without the weight of the last one." Then he had sat down. Martin Chen had called for the vote. It was not unanimous. Louis Farber voted against the leadership change, which Grace had expected. Farber's loyalty was not cynical, it was genuine. The loyalty of a man who had believed in Ryan Montgomery when believing had required something, and Grace respected it even as she watched it be outvoted. Sandra Okafor voted for the change with the expression of someone who had been waiting for the situation to become clear enough to act on, and it had. The vote was 4-2. Ryan Montgomery stepped down as CEO of Montgomery Technologies on a Friday afternoon in November in a boardroom he had built, with the composure of a man who had decided that the way you leave something matters as much as what you built while you were there. He had shaken hands with Chen and Okafor. He had nodded at Farber, who had nodded back with the expression of a man who disagreed with the outcome but respected the manner of it. He had walked past Grace without stopping, and then he had stopped, and turned, and looked at her with the specific directness that she had come to recognize as the version of Ryan Montgomery that had been arriving incrementally since the night she walked out into the rain. "The interim CEO appointment goes to the board's discretion," he said. "I recommended they consider an external candidate with a technology background rather than an internal promotion." He paused. "I also told them that any partnership framework with your company should be negotiated with you directly and without the involvement of my legal team, since the relevant history makes that a conflict." "That was fair," she said. "I'm trying to be," he said. And then he had left. Now it was Monday morning, and Grace was in Philip Cross's office, which smelled like old books and expensive coffee, and the notebook was on the desk in front of her inside a clear evidence sleeve, and she was looking at it with her hands in her lap because she did not trust herself to touch it without the sleeve. Not because she was afraid of damaging it, but because some things need to be held correctly the first time you hold them again. Philip Cross was across the desk. He had the expression of a man who was doing professional recalibration in real time, adjusting his understanding of who Grace Carter was and what that meant for the shape of the situation going forward. It was not a comfortable expression. It was, however, an honest one, which Grace had found was more than she could say for a number of people she had dealt with recently. "The civil complaint," she said. "Vance's attorneys filed a withdrawal Friday afternoon," Philip said, 4 hours after Judge Moss's fraud referral notice was delivered to Soames's office. He folded his hands on the desk. "The referral carries real weight. Soames knows it. Vance knows it. The fabricated consulting documentation is the kind of thing that, in a fraud proceeding, creates exposure that dwarfs whatever advantage the IP theft was meant to provide. And the patent filing. Still active, but with the Caldwell authentication certification, your time-stamped encrypted archive, the academic records, and now the notebook, which is the primary derivation document in your own handwriting with paper and ink that can be dated independently if necessary. The priority claim is not a close question." He paused. "Your IP attorney can take it from here. It's not fast, but it's not complicated anymore." Grace looked at the notebook through the clear sleeve. She could see the handwriting, her own, from 3 years ago, the particular density of it when she was working through something. Letters that got smaller and more compressed as the mathematics got more complex, as if she were trying to fit more thought into less space. She recognized the page she was looking at, the third-order derivation, the calculation that had taken her 4 afternoons to get right, that she had started over twice. That had been the moment when she understood the ceramic bonding sequence would work. "Victoria Hayes," she said. Philip was quiet for a moment. "She submitted a voluntary statement to Soames's firm on Thursday night. It covers her role in the Access events and the consulting documentation. She's cooperating." He paused. "I don't know what her motivation was. The statement was delivered without prior notice." Grace thought about the note in the courier envelope. "This belongs to her. I'm sorry it took me this long." She thought about Victoria on the sofa with the blanket around her shoulders, comfortable in the specific way of someone who has made themselves at home in a space that belongs to someone else. She thought about the email chain, the mother's situation, the reduction of Eleanor's illness to an operational variable, a scheduling consideration, an inconvenience that could be leveraged. She did not know what had moved Victoria to return the notebook and give the statement. She was not certain she needed to know. Some things happen in people for reasons that were private and complicated and not hers to parse. What mattered was that the notebook was on the desk, and the statement had been given, and the situation had changed because of it. "I won't be pursuing a civil claim against her," Grace said. Philip looked at her. "You have significant grounds." I know. She looked at him steadily. I'm not pursuing it. Philip nodded, once without pressing further. He had been a lawyer long enough to recognize when a decision had been made. She picked up the evidence sleeve. She stood. She thanked him. She left. The Caldwell Global Technology Conference opened on a Thursday morning in the kind of venue that had been built for exactly this purpose. A space designed to make the work feel as significant as it was. High ceilings, clean acoustics, the particular atmosphere of a room full of people who had spent their careers caring about specific, difficult things and were here to see what other people had done with the same intensity of care. Grace arrived at 6 in the morning, 3 hours before the keynote. The stage team gave her the walkthrough. Lighting positions, microphone placement, the location of the demonstration unit that Daniel and 2 members of her team had spent the previous day installing and testing. The unit was smaller than the warehouse version, purpose-built for presentation, but functionally identical. It sat on a platform at the center of the stage under lights that showed the ceramic housing clearly, the calibration panels, the specific geometry of something that had been designed not just to work, but to be seen working. She stood on the stage alone for a few minutes after the team left. The auditorium was empty. The seats went back a long way. 2,000, the conference program said, with overflow viewing in adjacent rooms. She looked at the space and thought about 4 years of small hours and shredded paper and the back of a cafe counter and a study in a house where she had been invisible by choice. And she thought about Eleanor's hands making a blanket. And she thought about the specific quality of the silence in the warehouse on the night the calibration numbers came back clean for the 3rd time. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something quieter and more durable than triumph. The feeling of someone who has carried something to the place it was always going and can finally set it down. She went backstage and drank coffee and reviewed her notes, which she didn't need but read anyway. At 9 a.m., the auditorium was full. Edmund Fraze introduced her with the economy of language that characterized people who understood that the best introduction steps back and lets the things speak. He said her name, her credentials, the title of her presentation, and sat down. Grace walked out. The auditorium was quiet in the way that large spaces full of attentive people are quiet. Not silence, but the directed attention of 2,000 people pointed at the same place. She felt it as a physical thing, the weight of that attention, and she did not step back from it. She had spent 5 years stepping back from things. She was done with that. She spoke for 4 minutes without the demonstration. Context, framework, the problem she had set out to solve and why it mattered, the state of the existing technology, and where it failed. She spoke in the register of someone who had been thinking about these questions for a long time and had the specific fluency of genuine expertise, not performed, not managed, just the natural compression of someone who knows their subject at a cellular level, speaking to people who are equipped to understand it. Then she ran the demonstration. The propulsion system operated for 6 minutes at 3 separate output levels, each one higher than the previous, each one producing clean data on the screens flanking the stage. The ceramic thermal management held at temperatures that the existing technology could not sustain. The combustion suppression performed at the efficiency level her mathematics had predicted. The numbers on the screens matched the numbers she had derived 3 years ago on paper at a cafe counter. The auditorium was very quiet for the 6 minutes the demonstration ran. When it ended, the quiet held for another 3 seconds. Then it was not quiet. Grace stood on the stage and the sound arrived like something physical, the way sound at that volume and from that many sources arrives as a force rather than just a perception. And she stood still in it and let it land, and she did not smile in the way of someone performing the appropriate response to a reception. She smiled the way you smile when something you made works the way you knew it would work. The private satisfaction of a calculation confirmed, wearing a public face only because the situation required it. In the second row, Martin Chen was on his feet. Beside him, Sandra Okafor. Around them, 2,000 people in the field that Grace Carter had been building towards since she was a doctoral student who had not yet needed to make the choice between ambition and love, and had chosen love, and had spent the intervening years carrying both. She was 41 years old. She had her whole career in front of her. She stood on the stage and she breathed. Garrett Vance was not in the auditorium. He had been registered for the conference. His name had appeared on the attendee list as recently as Tuesday. On Thursday morning, his registration showed as canceled. Grace had noted it when Daniel sent her the updated list Wednesday night. She had not been surprised. The fraud referral, the withdrawal of the civil complaint, the collapse of the IP theft strategy. Vance was a man who understood when a position was untenable and had the instinct to withdraw rather than be seen losing. It was a different instinct from Ryan's, which had been to hold position past the point of sense. Neither was admirable, but Vance's was at least efficient. He was gone, and the work was here, and the room was on its feet, and that was the shape of the outcome. The question of the notebook, what had happened to it between the cafe shelf and Philip Cross's desk? Grace had thought about carefully and arrived at a version of events she believed was likely, if not provable. Victoria had taken it from the cafe not to give to Vance, but to hold, a kind of insurance, the specific instinct of someone who understood the value of what she had and wasn't ready to surrender it entirely. She had given Vance the encrypted file access, the materials list, the consulting timeline. She had not given him the notebook, and when the situation had deteriorated, when Soames' fraud referral landed, and the civil complaint collapsed, and Victoria understood that the edifice she had helped build was coming down with people still inside it, she had sent the notebook back. It was not redemption. Grace was not inclined to call it that. It was something more ordinary and more human. A person who had done a harmful thing, and when the cost of continuing to do it became clear, had chosen to stop. The choice was better than the alternative. It was not the same as not having made the harmful choice in the first place. Grace had thought about what she wanted to feel about Victoria and had arrived, with the same methodical honesty she brought to her engineering, at an answer that was not clean. She was not sorry that Victoria had acted as she had, because without the threat, the board meeting would not have happened when it did, and the authentication certification would not have been filed, and the medical records would not have been subpoenaed, and Ryan would not have been forced into the particular clarity that had produced his 11 minutes in the boardroom. She was not grateful for the harm. She was simply done with it. It had happened. It was finished. It was not the part of the story she wanted to carry. After the keynote, she did 3 interviews in the corridor outside the main hall, 2 industry publications, and 1 general technology outlet whose journalist asked the question Grace had been expecting and had prepared for and still found when it arrived, more pointed than she'd anticipated. "Dr. Carter," the journalist said, "your background includes a significant personal history with Montgomery Technologies. You're currently the 3rd largest individual shareholder, and your former husband stepped down as CEO last week. How much of what you've built has been about what you wanted to create versus what you wanted to prove?" The corridor was busy around them, people moving, the ambient noise of a conference mid-session. Grace looked at the journalist for a moment. "I left a marriage," she said. "I didn't leave the work. The work was always going to be the work regardless of the marriage." She paused. "I don't think those things are incompatible, wanting to create something and wanting to prove you're capable of it. Most significant things get built from both." "And Montgomery Technologies? The shareholder position?" "The technology needs infrastructure that would take years to build from nothing. Montgomery has it. That's a practical fact, not a personal statement." The journalist wrote something. "And your former husband's role going forward?" Grace considered the question with the same directness she had brought to everything in the last several weeks. "I don't know what his role going forward is," she said. "That's his to decide." The interviews finished. She found Daniel in the corridor and they stood together for a moment, not speaking, just in the particular silence of 2 people who have been through something difficult and come out the other side of it still standing. Daniel had the expression of someone who was relieved in a way he was not going to dramatize, because dramatizing it would require acknowledging how much he had not been certain about the outcome. "The partnership framework," Grace said. "Chen wants a meeting next week." "I know. Get me a clean slate on the terms. I don't want anything inherited from whatever Philip had been preparing. New council, new framework." "Already started," Daniel said. She looked at him. He looked back. The conversation they were not having, about the last 4 weeks, about the warehouse at 4 a.m., about the courthouse hallway and the board meeting and the notebook and the 6 minutes on stage, was one they would probably never have, not explicitly, because it didn't need to be had. It was in the record of what they had done, which was the only record that mattered. Go home, she said. In a while, he said. She nodded and left him there. She found Ryan in the atrium outside the main hall. She had not known he would be there, and then, when she saw him, understood that she had known he would be there, that some part of her had known and had not examined the knowledge too closely. He was standing near the far wall, slightly apart from the movement of the conference crowd, in a jacket she didn't recognize. Dark. Not the tailored Montgomery Technologies register. Something less deliberate. The jacket of a man who had dressed for an occasion without treating the occasion as a performance. He had a coffee cup in his hand, and he was watching the crowd with the expression of someone who was present in a room, but not of it, which was a different relationship to a room than he had ever had in her experience of him. He saw her. He didn't move toward her. She moved toward him because she chose to, because she wanted to, because 5 years was a long time and a short time, and she was finished with the particular discipline of pretending that things were simpler than they were. The demonstration was extraordinary, he said. Thank you. I watched from the overflow room. He paused. I thought about getting a seat in the main hall, and then I thought that was probably not the right call. It wasn't, she said, but the overflow room was fine. Something crossed his face. Brief, wry, honest. Not a smile exactly, but the shape a smile makes when the person making it understands that they don't entirely have the right to it. The board has begun preliminary discussions with your company about the partnership framework, he said. I know. I'm not part of those discussions. I know that too. He looked at her. The atrium was full of movement around them, people with lanyards and coffee cups, and the specific energized purposefulness of a conference on a good day. They stood in it like something the movement was dividing around, two people holding still in the middle of a current. The notebook came back, he said. It was not a question. Yes. Victoria. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. She watched him process it, not with visible emotion, but with the specific quality of a man absorbing information that implicates him, that traces a line from someone else's action back through his own sphere, his own failures of attention, the people he had kept close and the access he had granted and what that access had cost. I didn't know what she was doing, he said. I know you didn't. That's not... He stopped. That doesn't make it not my responsibility. No, she said. It doesn't. He nodded, once, the nod of someone accepting a thing they had already accepted privately, but needed to hear confirmed externally. You're not pursuing action against her, he said. No. Can I ask why? Grace looked at the coffee cup in his hand, the unfamiliar jacket, the face she had looked at across 5 years of dinners and had understood less than she should have, which was something she owned as much as he did, because understanding was a two-person project, and she had chosen, for her own reasons, not to show him what there was to understand. Because I don't want to spend the next 2 years carrying it, she said. I want to build things. I don't want to spend the time I have left for building things on dismantling people who have already dismantled themselves. He looked at her for a long moment. That's a better answer than I would have given, he said. I know, she said. And something in that exchange, the honesty of it, the specific absence of cruelty on either side, was the closest they came to what the marriage might have been. The conversation they might have been having across 5 years of dinners, if the conditions had been different, if he had asked the right questions, if she had not made herself smaller to fit a space that was too small, if the timing and the choices and the circumstances had arranged themselves differently. They hadn't. The atrium moved around them. The conference continued its purposeful hum. Somewhere in the main hall, the next presenter was taking the stage for a topic that would be reported as second best of the conference, which was a distinction that would follow that presenter with mixed feelings for a while. I'm going to ask you something, Ryan said. She waited. And you don't have to answer it. Then ask it. He looked at her directly, with the full frontal honesty that she had seen arriving in increments since the night in the warehouse. Did you know? When you started? Did you know it would end here? She thought about the question seriously, with the same rigor she brought to everything. I knew what I was building, she said. I didn't know what it would cost. She paused. I thought I did. I didn't. He nodded slowly. Worth it, he said. She looked past him, through the atrium glass, at the November sky outside, the same late autumn blue that had been over the care facility that morning when Eleanor's hand was warm and present, and she had said good news with the clarity of a woman who still knew, on some level, that the disease had not yet reached, when her daughter's voice contained something important. Yes, Grace said. Worth it. They stood for another moment. Not comfortably, not uncomfortably. Just in the factual proximity of two people who had shared 5 years of a life, and the end of it, and everything that had happened since, standing in an atrium in November while the world around them moved. Then Grace picked up her bag. Take care of yourself, Ryan, she said. It was not a dismissal. It was not a kindness exactly, not in the soft sense. It was what it was, a statement of genuine, unromantic wish, offered by a woman who had stopped wishing for things she could not build and had learned, across years that had cost her more than she would have chosen, to wish clearly and without decoration for what she actually meant. He said, You too, Grace. She walked out of the atrium into the November afternoon, and the light was the color it is when the year is turning, when the last of the warmth is mostly memory, and the cold has the clean quality of something that doesn't apologize for being what it is. And she put her coat on and walked to her car and sat for a moment with the engine off, her hands in her lap, the city around her going about the ordinary, extraordinary business of being itself. She thought about Eleanor's 2 pats on the back of her hand. I know, I'm here, go do what you need to do. She started the car. She had 3 things to do before the end of the day. Call the Caldwell Authentication Board to begin the formal IP priority documentation process. Review the first draft of the partnership framework terms that Daniel's new counsel had sent at noon, and go back to Meridian Care to sit with her mother for the rest of the evening. The partnership framework could wait until tomorrow. The IP documentation could wait until tomorrow. She drove to Meridian Care through the November streets, through the particular light of a day that had been large and was now quietly ending, and she parked in the lot she knew well enough that she took the turn before the sign, and she went inside and down the corridor and into her mother's room. Eleanor was awake. She was looking at the window with the soft, present attention she sometimes had in the late afternoon, tracking the light the way people track something they find beautiful without needing to name it. Grace sat down beside her. She took Eleanor's hand. Eleanor did not turn from the window immediately. She looked at the light for another moment, and then she turned and looked at Grace, and something in her face settled, a small, precise settling, the expression of someone who has found the thing they were looking for and can now be still. You're back, Eleanor said. I'm back, Grace said. Eleanor looked at her daughter's face for a long moment, with the kind of looking that goes past the surface of a thing that is not seen so much as knowing. Then she reached out with her free hand and touched Grace's cheek, once with the back of her fingers, a gesture so familiar and so specific that it arrived in Grace's chest like something dropped from a height, like the feeling of something landing that has been falling for a long time. Outside the window, the November light was doing what November light does at the end of a day, softening at the edges, going amber and then going, the long, slow departure of it, unhurried and complete. Grace held her mother's hand. The room was quiet. The story was not finished, because stories are not finished. The partnership framework would need to be negotiated carefully, and the IP case would take the time it took, and there would be other configurations of difficulty that Grace Carter had not yet thought to prepare for, because that was the nature of building things in the actual world rather than in the clean theoretical space of a mathematical proof. But the part that had needed to be resolved was resolved. The thing she had carried to the place it was going had arrived. The work existed in the world now, seen, confirmed, beyond the reach of people who had tried to take it. She had not won the way people win in stories. She had not stood triumphant over a defeated enemy. She had not reclaimed the marriage, or erased the years, or undone the specific accumulation of small abandonments that had constituted her life in Ryan Montgomery's house. She had simply built something true in conditions that were difficult, and she had protected it when it was threatened, and she had stood on a stage and shown it to the world. And now she was sitting beside her mother in a room that smelled like hand lotion and the end of a long day, and Eleanor's hand was warm in hers, and outside the window the light was going, and it was enough. It was, in the most complete and undecorated sense of the word, enough. Grace Carter sat with her mother until the room was dark and the light outside had gone entirely. And then she turned on the small lamp beside Eleanor's chair, and they stayed in the warm circle of it together. And the day ended the way the best days end. Not with triumph, not with resolution in the dramatic sense, but with two people in a room who knew each other, who had known each other through everything that changes and everything that doesn't, sitting in the ordinary, irreplaceable fact of each other's company. That was the whole of it. That was all of it. That was everything. A wholly fictional story created for artistic and entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, events, and institutions depicted are independently imagined and bear no connection to real persons or real events.